So good morning and welcome to our 15th annual Human Trafficking Symposium. It's hard to believe it's been 15 years, and for those of you that have been here before, thank you for your attendance again. If you're new, we'd like to welcome you, and regardless of where you fall on your understanding of human trafficking, we have some pretty dynamic speakers today, and you'll come away with not only a base understanding of human trafficking, but also some of the most recent changes that's gone on in that world, in that community. So, in order to keep things moving, what we'd like to ask is that you hold all questions till the end. We're going to have a panel that will answer any question you have related to this subject, as well as provide you some very pertinent information regarding this subject. Today, we'll begin with changing the way we think about human trafficking in Colorado. This presentation is going to illuminate the realities of trafficking in our state, and whether you are new to the topic or have heard many presentations on human trafficking, you're going to learn something today from Cara, beg your pardon. So let me introduce, to start with, Cara Napolitano. She is the Research and Training Manager at the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, based in Denver, Colorado. Cara holds an MA in International Development with concentration in International Human Rights Law from the University of Denver. Before completing her education, she spent 8 years working and volunteering in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, working mostly with education-based NGOs in post-conflict areas. She was appointed to the Governor's Colorado Human Trafficking Council Prevention Task Force in 2018 and the Equitable Access Task Force in 2022. For the last few years, she has led training and education efforts in LCHT, training more than 20,000 professionals across rural and urban Colorado. At this time, I'd like to welcome Cara. All right.
Good morning. Let me just get set up here. I can't stand still, so I have to put my microphone on so I can wander on the stage. All right. So, thank you so much for starting your weekend with us. Okay, let me make sure this is working. Are we doing okay? Okay. So I appreciate you. I mean, it's a tough way to start your Saturday morning, talking about human trafficking. We're good? I'm afraid some of the mics up here, there's too many mics. Okay, I'll stand back. I just want to say I appreciate you, spending the time, coming out here on a Saturday to learn about this important issue. My name's Cara. I hate bios, but I appreciate the introduction, Chris. I work for an organization called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. We are Denver-based. We've been around since 2005, so really since the beginning of this movement, and I've been with the organization since 2015. My educational background is in international human rights law, but I've been working with this organization now since 2015 and really have learned so much about what trafficking looks like here in Colorado. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Perhaps like some of you, I used to think of human trafficking as this faraway problem that happens in other countries or when people are being forced across borders. And that's how we're sort of originally taught about this, is how we start to learn about this issue here in the US often. But as I have worked here now on this issue here in Colorado, I've realized that trafficking not only happens everywhere, but the root causes that lead to trafficking, inequities, marginalization of vulnerable communities. These things are the same no matter where you go. We've got inequities and marginalized communities and individuals all over Colorado. So trafficking looks different here than it does in other places, but it is just as persistent and just as present. And so we're going to talk about it as a whole, sort of where we see trafficking in what industries across the state. We're going to talk about both labor and sex trafficking today. And as I talk through this, I'll start big picture and then narrow it down and tell a few stories from your community here in the greater Colorado Springs area. Our organization, the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, I'll say LCHT from now on because that's a lot of words. We manage the statewide human trafficking hotline, and we've done so since 2013. In my role, I have read every single report that's ever come through the Colorado hotline, every single one. We get about 1,000 calls or texts every year. And so all the stories that I'm telling you today are real, true stories, things that have happened here in Colorado. That's where that all comes from, just so you know. So this is what I hope to cover. I've got about 50 minutes or so to cover a lot of stuff. So don't worry, we will have time for questions during the panel later. But first I want to just get us on the same page about what human trafficking really is. I think there's a lot of misinformation and in some cases even disinformation about what human trafficking is. So we're going to do a little bit of myth busting as I also talk through the legal definitions of what human trafficking is internationally and here in Colorado. And I want you to be able to make that distinction from a legal perspective. Perhaps you're a mandatory reporter of child abuse. What are your mandatory reporting requirements? What is the legal recourse that a trafficking survivor could take? But then also from a lived experience perspective, how is the abuse going to be similar to other forms of abuse that you may have seen or worked with, like domestic violence or child abuse? And how is it going to be a little bit different? How might you treat that trauma differently? There's a lot of mental health modalities that are being used specifically for human trafficking survivors. Not going to go into those today in a Human Trafficking 101, but knowing that the trauma is different and knowing that there are specialists out there to support survivors is also important. We'll talk through red flags and behavioral cues. Kind of general ones. There's no easy way to make identifications. Most of the time, survivors are not going to self-identify as victims of trafficking. They're not going to be asking for help, and in many cases, they'll be actively trying to hide their lived experience from you. So it is important that we can understand what some red flags may be so that we can dig a little deeper and maybe ask some more questions or some better questions of individuals who we suspect may be experiencing exploitation. So I'll give you some tools for that. And I think throughout the presentation, we'll be talking about the importance of having a trauma-informed care approach and multi-sector collaboration. No one organization, no one sector can end this crime on their own. It's not just law enforcement, it's not just healthcare providers, it's not just child welfare, it's not just people working in homelessness or substance abuse, it's everybody. And it's also community members to bring awareness to the truth about what human trafficking is, and so that we stop looking for maybe the wrong people or in the wrong places. So it's a community-wide effort, and I think that's why this symposium is hosted every year, hopefully. It's one of the reasons. So we're going to talk about how you can get involved, how you can plug in, and hopefully leave you as many resources as possible. My colleague Caitlin back there, Caitlin, hi Caitlin. She's got a table with a bunch of information about the hotline, hotline cards, pamphlets that you can give out to individuals depending on your interaction with potential survivors. So if that's helpful, you can grab some from the table back there when I'm done talking, or we can also send boxes of them to you for free. So if you are working in a profession where you're likely to come into contact with a survivor of trafficking, just let us know, and we can send you a box. Everything's in both English and Spanish. So I'd like to start with this slide. This parallel movement slide, that's kind of jargony, parallel movements or intersecting movements, whatever you want to call it. There's so many other parts of this story. Human trafficking never just happens in a box. No one is ever just trafficked. There is so much more to their stories. People are often experiencing multiple forms of abuse or violence alongside their trafficking experience, and their identities or prior lived experiences of trauma are going to affect their ability to access resources or their perceived ability to access resources or even their comfortability with disclosing their lived experience. So we have to take all of this into account when we think about human trafficking. It's usually not what it looks like in the movies. Just going to go ahead and say it, the movie Taken. Not so great for this movement, not an accurate portrayal of what human trafficking really is. And it's really pigeonholed the movement. It's made us think that all trafficking survivors are kidnapped and chained to a bed, and Liam Neeson is going to crash through the roof and save everyone. And that's really not what this looks like. It's so much more nuanced. And so as I'm talking through this, I want you to be thinking about the people in your respective communities who are vulnerable, just generally, not necessarily to trafficking. But where can you find them? And what are the needs that they have that aren't being met? And where might a trafficker be able to step in and offer to meet those needs? Because that's what trafficking usually looks like. That's what recruitment usually looks like. So someone is experiencing homelessness, and they need a place to stay, and it started to snow in Colorado, and it's cold. It was cold this morning, right? If somebody offers that person a place to stay, they accept because they don't want to sleep outside again in negative 20-degree weather, What kind of power will that person now have over that potential victim? And what happens when they threaten to kick them out? What will they do to try to stay in that housing? And how might that lead to their exploitation? So I want you to be thinking again about vulnerable people and any previous trainings you've ever had about interpersonal violence or child abuse or trauma, because those are going to be relevant to this conversation as well. To that end, I'm going to start us off with a quick video. Little disclaimer, there's a little bit of rough language in here, but nothing violent or anything like that. So just be ready for some harsh language, and that's about it. This video is about 3 minutes. I don't know if the sound's playing yet, gentlemen. It's about 3 minutes. It's called Birth into Inequality, okay? And this video is specifically about female survivors of sex trafficking. Survivors of sex trafficking can be any gender. We also have labor trafficking that we're going to talk about too. But I still like this video, even though it's only talking about one lived experience. Because about 70 to 90% of trafficking survivors have experienced prior trauma. That's what the data says. I've been working in this field for a long time. I'm just going to go ahead and say all of them have prior trauma, all of the survivors of trafficking. So as you're listening to this video, be thinking about the vulnerable populations in your community.
When I was a young child, I was called stupid, a bitch, a whore, a slut. I was called names all the time. I wasn't loved.
My mom actually was diagnosed with cancer when I was 13, and within 90 days she passed. And it was incredibly traumatic on the entire family. My dad is the one that took it the hardest. He wasn't buying food, he just went into a depression.
Back then, my legs were just always bruised up. She beat us with extension cords. I finally pulled down my pants and showed the gym teacher, like, I'm not getting dressed. Look at this. And she's like, well, I'm going to call your mom. Thank you. Can you call my dad?
Yo le conté a la persona que se encargaba de la biblioteca lo que me estaba pasando. Y ellos trataron de ir a mi casa y hablar con mis papás. Y lo único que conseguí fue que me golpearan más y hacerme hacer trabajos más duros.
When my father would come home drunk or whatever it was, I would basically just freeze. I would be paralyzed, you know. I would just hide somewhere and hope that he didn't come bother me that night. It was kind of just this terrorist living in the house.
My mom, really used to pick on me. I liked my dad the most, so me and her, we never got along. So when my dad started going to jail and she said that he was hitting her, I never believed her. When she actually had, a bruise on her eye, I couldn't really say that he didn't do it. So it was pretty hard for me when I figured it out.
My mother was raped repeatedly. My mother has a lot of trauma. She never healed. She had her own issues, and she has a lot of mental health issues. She's now schizophrenic. So if that doesn't let you know kind of where I came from.
My dad was always gone. My dad had, he was a drug addict, and he kind of just disappeared. So, I kind of grew up with my mom, single mom of 3 girls, and she always worked, so I kind of was alone. Yeah, I had my sisters, but I was kind of I'm the middle child. I was kind of the odd one out.
I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. I didn't know my self-worth or understand who I was. And the fact that I didn't have a dad at home and my mom was always at the restaurant, I felt like I didn't have a best friend.
I never, ever, ever thought in my whole, as a child growing up, that I would end up prostituting. I was very impressionable. I was very vulnerable. I mean, I was alone. Had nowhere to go. And things with him started getting violent pretty early on. But it wasn't unusual for me because I come from a home like that. So when he would hit me, I would think that it was because he loved me. He was my world.
And then in the year oh, you couldn't hear me, sorry. My bad. And then in the year 2000, we finally defined human trafficking into statute. And that began this like anti-trafficking journey or movement, which some of us who work in the movement like to call it. So 2000, that's 22 years ago. That is not very long, right? For anyone who's worked in systems, the education system, the healthcare, law enforcement system, we know that 20 years is not that long. It takes a long time to change hearts and minds. It takes a long time to onboard a sector into a anti-trafficking movement, like to make sure that everyone in a sector has been trained on what human trafficking really is and how they're legally mandated to respond to it. So it's important to know that because we've got this ancient crime, right? Something that people have been doing to each other for thousands of years, and we've got this really nascent response. And the truth is that most law enforcement officers, most healthcare providers, most child welfare workers, most folks working in the homelessness space or with substance abuse still haven't had a basic human trafficking 101. Some of them have, and you've got a human trafficking unit here, and we're gonna talk about all the good things that have happened too, but it's important to remember that not all of them have. So some people, even the people who are likely to come into contact with survivors of trafficking, haven't necessarily, are basing their definition of what human trafficking is on the movie Taken, right? Which can be problematic. So I want to give you a big picture idea of what human trafficking is from a global perspective. I won't be testing you later. You don't have to write all this down, but I'm going to drop some numbers on you. So the International Labor Organization and which is the ILO and the Walk Free Foundation, they put out the global estimates of modern slavery every few years, and they just put out a new report in September. They estimate, and these are our best global estimates of human trafficking numbers, they estimate that around 50 million people in the world are being trafficked today. On any given day, 50 million people are being trafficked. That's their estimate. Now I'm going to parse these numbers out. So of the 50 million, 22 million are in forced marriages, okay? People might think that forced marriage is a faraway problem. It's not. We've got lots of cases of forced marriage here in Colorado, and they come into our purview when not only are they being forced to marry, but they're also being forced to work without pay or to have sex without consenting to it with people outside of the marriage, right? So we see forced sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and forced marriage happening all at the same time in some cases. That's 22 million of that 50 million. Now we've got 28 million in what's considered forced labor. In the international definition of human trafficking, we include sex trafficking in those forced labor numbers. So as I'm talking through those numbers of forced labor, that includes both sex and labor trafficking. This is that international definition. So at the UN level, we came together in the year 2000 and we defined human trafficking as a severe form of exploitation for labor, including sex as a form of labor, sex work, stripping for money, that's a form of labor, right? Through the use of force or fraud or coercion or some combination thereof. This is that global definition. So if I come back to that 28 million number, when I further parse that out, we've got about 4 million individuals who are currently involved in state-sanctioned forced labor. That's like forced prison labor, or perhaps you're familiar with the situation in Western China where about 1.5 million Uyghurs are imprisoned in a labor camp, or several labor camps. So that's 4 million individuals. Then we've got 24 million more traditional forms, what we consider traditional forms here in the US, of forced labor and sex trafficking. When you further parse out that 24 million, about 6.3 million are in sex trafficking situations and about 17.7 million in labor trafficking. So about 3 times as many people being labor trafficked in the world today than in sex trafficking. And that's really important to remember because we barely talk about labor trafficking. So we're going to talk about both today, how both sex trafficking and labor trafficking show up in our Colorado communities. A couple more things I want to note about those global statistics. About 70% of sex trafficking survivors are female. That leaves 30% male, trans, and other non-binary genders. Trans women are particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking, and importantly, men and boys are trafficked for sex also. It's just something, again, we never see pictured, we never see movies made about it, and it's really important to remember that. When it comes to labor trafficking, it is majority male, but we see women and other genders trafficked for labor as well. Depends on what sector you're in. Men are being trafficked in construction and in landscaping, women in agriculture and domestic servitude. So overall, of the 50 million, 54% are female, and 46% are male or other genders. 54% female, not 99, right? So that's really important to remember too, because we often see this portrayed as only female survivors of sex trafficking. One last thing I'll say about those big numbers, about 50% of those 50 million are involved in some situation of debt bondage, meaning they owe something to somebody else. It could be a real debt or a perceived debt, so they owe a smuggling fee, they owe for their housing, or perhaps they just owe someone their life, or owe their parents for taking care of them for so long. Right, so we see debt bondage involved in some way in so many people's lived experience. This next slide here is where is the federal definition of human trafficking. This is a TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We wrote this in the same year. So in the year 2000, the United States passed their very first anti-trafficking legislation. It's not that it was legal before that, because these were horrible crimes being committed, but what it did is it brought together a movement. It brought together this term of exploitation and started creating a more coordinated and collaborative response to this crime. But again, it was really nascent. We had a really a shallow understanding of what human trafficking was when we wrote this legislation, and we've come a long way in the last 22 years, which is what you're going to hear about for the rest of today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because I think it's important to understand these nuances of what we see here in the state. As I'm talking through the TVPA, you can consider this almost the same as our Colorado legislation. Now, it's not word for word the same, but we've got the same 3 categories of trafficking here in Colorado. So as I'm talking through this, you can consider this the same as Colorado legislation, and then I think Christian will clarify that a little bit later. So in the US, we parsed out sex trafficking from labor trafficking. We have different values around sex work. It's often not considered real work. It's not necessarily reflective of my values, but societally, we parsed out sex trafficking from labor trafficking. And then we made a third category, minor sex trafficking. And that's where we made an exception to the force, fraud, or coercion rule. So this first, So this first category up here, minor sex trafficking, we've got those who are under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex. Doesn't matter if there's force, fraud, or coercion. So what we're saying in the passage of the law this way is that minors can't consent to commercial sex, even when they say they're consenting. And there doesn't have to be anyone forcing or frauding or coercing them into the situation for it to be trafficking, because we've decided as a society that kids under the age of 18 can't consent to commercial sex, period. Even when they're consenting, they can't legally consent. So I'm going to tell some stories here to illustrate all of this. As I said, these are real stories, things that have happened here in Colorado. So let's say you've got an 8-year-old kid, and they are being sold for sex by their parents via Facebook Messenger and Craigslist. On the weekends from the house, and then sometimes at events like the state fair or Broncos games. That's egregious. It's not a nice story. But you obviously, you can wrap your head around that. Like, no 8-year-old kid is willingly engaging in commercial sex, and you've got obvious perpetrators, the parents in this case, right? That's easier for us to wrap our head around. It gets more complicated when you've got, let's say, a 17-year-old kid who maybe looks like an adult and dresses like an adult and has a lot more autonomy because of their age. But of course, their brains aren't fully developed until they're 26 years old or 27 years old, to be clear. So they're still a kid. And they run away from home. And let's say they ran away from home for a really good reason. It was terrible there. They were experiencing violence in the home. They ran away. They're on the street, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to survive. And they're purposefully not engaging with systems. They're not talking to law enforcement. They're not going into a shelter because they're scared. They don't want to be sent home. They don't want to be found, right? So they figure out pretty quickly that they can trade sex to meet their survival needs. They can trade sex for a place to stay for the night or for food, maybe even for drugs. Trading sex for anything of value makes it commercial. So it doesn't have to be money. Could be all those things I just named. And it's any sex act. So it could be prostitution, could be pornography, webcamming, stripping. Any minor who's trading anything of value for a sex act is engaging in sex work, is engaging in commercial sex, and is therefore a victim of human trafficking, even though there's no perpetrator in that case. There's no force or fraud or coercion. No one's forcing them into that situation. Now, you could certainly argue that like society is forcing them into that, right? Or whatever, it's survival sex. Yes, I would agree with you. But that's not how our laws usually work. So this is a unique law in that there can be a victim of a crime without there necessarily being a perpetrator. But that 17-year-old should get treated just the same as the 8-year-old, as a victim of a terrible crime for which they're going to need serious help in recovering from the trauma. That's not necessarily how they always get treated or perceived, right? They look like they're willfully engaging in it. We tend to add a lot of stigma or blame people who are engaging in sex work. We don't tend to like it, right? So that 17-year-old is probably thinking, people are going to judge me, they're not going to believe me, and they probably think they can be arrested for the crime of prostitution. They can't, but they're not going to have had a human trafficking 101 like you, right? So they're scared. They're not disclosing their lived experience of trafficking because they're scared of all of those things. So not only are they not self-identifying as a victim of trafficking, but they're actively hiding it from you. And that makes it complicated. The second category here is where we acknowledge choice. Of course, people who are 18 or over do willingly engage in commercial sex. Like it or not, they do, right? So what we're saying here is if someone is engaging in commercial sex by choice, then they're a sex worker. And if they're being forced or frauded or coerced into that situation, then they're being sex trafficked as an adult. But there does have to be those elements of force, fraud, or coercion. So that same 17-year-old, let's say a week passes and they have a birthday, and now they're 18. Same kid, 1 week later, now can be arrested for the crime of prostitution. They no longer have those legal protections. It's complicated. Now, for this other category here, of course, adults are commonly trafficked for sex and labor. About 75% of the 50 million that I've referred to now several times are adults. 75%, 25% are minors. So we see this a lot more than it's pictured on social media or in the movies. Let me tell you another story about how this can be complicated, because people are sort of coming in and out of these experiences. It's portrayed on social media that everyone's locked up in a basement. It's simply not the case. So let's say you've got an 18-year-old who's now legally an adult, brain not fully developed yet, but still legally an adult, and they have a baby. They've got a 1-year-old, and they're trying to figure out childcare. They can't afford childcare just like everyone else in Colorado, right? So they've got a mom who they live with, and mom says, I'll watch your kid, you have to get a night job. So that's perfect. She gets a night job, she starts stripping. She likes it. She's making great money, she's having fun. She gets to hang out with her kid all day, right? At the end of one of her shifts, after working there for a couple of months, her boss comes up to her, 2 o'clock in the morning, everyone's had some alcohol, and says, one of our clients gave me $200 to have sex with you, I want you to go do it. She says no, and he locks the door, beats her up, and tells her if she doesn't, she's fired. So she does it. She's terrified, and she needs a job. Do you think that she would go to law enforcement and just tell them that she's been sex trafficked afterwards? What are the chances? Probably not. She knows how she's dressed. She knows where she works. She knows that it's 3 o'clock in the morning. She might not get treated well at that law enforcement office. She might get arrested for prostitution. She's scared. Scared of the boss, scared of losing her job. The next day, she goes back to work because she needs the money. Now she's that much more likely of being trafficked again because her boss knows he can get away with it, and he does. Right? So people are coming in and out of this. They're not all locked up in a basement. She went home to her mom that night and to her baby, right? And it did happen several more times. So it's complicated. It's more complicated than it's often portrayed. Now, this third category here is forced labor. This is the one we don't talk about. It's not as sexy. We don't make movies about it. It is incredibly common. So we see two major forms of labor trafficking here in Colorado, in the formal economy and in the informal economy. So what I mean by that is in the formal economy, we see it in sectors where there's a lot of turnover, low wages, maybe seasonal work. So I'm talking about agriculture, ranching, anywhere where migrant farm workers work, meat packing plants, potato farms, something like that. We see it in domestic servitude. So someone's living in usually a wealthy person's home. They have a power over them because they have the wealth and the power. They speak English maybe, and they maybe hold their visa or promise them something. They're providing housing and food, so the person is totally dependent on them, and they're not getting paid. Or they're getting paid $2 a day, sleeping on a 2-inch mattress in the basement, not allowed to leave the house ever. We've had cases of that, several cases of that here in Colorado. That's domestic servitude. We see it in the construction industry, landscaping, a lot in the restaurants and hospitality industry as well, cleaning crews, that kind of thing. So that's the formal economy. In the informal economy, we see a lot of forced begging. So maybe you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire. There were forced begging rings of young people. We have that here as well. We see it in like forced criminality. So someone's being forced to sell drugs because they owe money to their drug dealer, and their drug dealer says, if you don't do this, I'll hurt you, or I'll hurt your family. So they're selling drugs, or muling drugs, which is carrying drugs across borders. Sometimes it's shoplifting. Had a case of a 16-year-old kid, a boy. He was being forced to shoplift his whole life by his parents. When he finally got caught for like the umpteenth time, he finally disclosed at the age of 16 that he'd been being forced to do that. That's labor trafficking. So if someone is forcing someone into a crime by force, fraud, or coercion, they are also being labor trafficked. Happens to a lot of young people, happens to a lot of people experiencing homelessness, happens to a lot of immigrants, often because they don't know their rights or they don't feel like they have access to their rights. This isn't limited to those who are foreign-born youth or females. This is just sort of a shout-out to some of these myths and misconceptions, but I've already knocked most of them out. I will just note, though, that often foreign nationals are disproportionately represented in survivor populations, meaning immigration status is being used as a form of coercion, commonly. Do this or I'll have your parents deported. Do this or I'll call ICE. Do this or I'll make sure you never get another temporary work visa and you won't be able to come back and make money to support your family. So people are putting up with horrible, abusive conditions so that they can, with the hope, that they'll someday be able to start making money to support their families or be able to get out of debt or get out of that situation. Okay, so another way to think through this definition here is this action means purpose model. So for it to be trafficking, and I'm not suggesting that if it's not trafficking, it doesn't matter, but for it to be trafficking, there has to be one thing from each one of these categories present for it to be considered trafficking. So we see sexual assault or different forms of abuse or wage theft often confused with trafficking. We also hear a lot about smuggling and trafficking. Smuggling is the movement of a human consensually across a border. It's illegal, but it's consensual. No one's being forced to work or forced into sex work. Smuggling can sometimes turn into trafficking, but they're certainly not the same thing, right? So just some distinctions there about kind of the things that we often hear conflated with the term. As I said, for it to be trafficking, one thing from each one of these categories has to be present. By far and away, the most common action is recruitment. So that's what I was asking you to think about before I started, as I started talking about half an hour ago. Who are the vulnerable people in your community that could be recruited by a trafficker? People experiencing homelessness, people using substances, people who've experienced abuse or neglect in their homes and are being pushed out or run away, right? They've experienced that prior trauma, they don't know what a healthy relationship looks like, and someone steps in and says, I love you, I'll take care of you. Someone who's using drugs, the trafficker might say, here are the drugs you're looking for. Don't worry about payment. We can talk about that later. For now, I just want to make sure that you feel good. You need a place to stay, it's snowing outside, and the last 3 nights that you slept outside, you got hypothermia. I've got a place for you, right? All of these things that people are being offered, you're looking for a job, I've got a great job, I'll pay you cash, right? All these things that people are being offered and accepting, that's not the crime, right? That's all very normal stuff. That's why people go with the trafficker, because they're being offered the things that they need and that we as a society or their families or their communities aren't offering them, at least not in an equitable way. And so the trafficker's recruiting by filling a need, and then the relationship shifts. And it might take a day, 2 days, 5 days a week. It might take a couple months of what we call grooming, right, to get someone to start doing what you want them to do. But that initial recruitment, much more subtle, much more nuanced, much more sneaky, right? Not the kidnapping one, the obtained narrative. That's that scary white van that's marauding the neighborhood that's going to steal your kids. That's not what trafficking looks like. Most traffickers are somebody that the victim knows, and usually someone that the victim knows and loves. I've got, there's lots of studies out there, so it depends on which one you're quoting. The one I'll quote right now says that 91% of traffickers are someone that the victim knows. That leaves only 9% for that stranger danger. I would say it's usually probably less. So we're talking about parents or guardians, sadly, high percentage. Intimate partners, those are the two big ones. And then we've got other family members, employers, teachers, coaches, religious authorities, people in positions of power that can use their power and their knowledge of the vulnerability of the victim to exploit them, right? Sometimes people are harbored, locked up, chained up. Google would have us believe that that's everyone. It's just not. But we do see people being held in a house, maybe all being held in one house on a farm. They're being brought to and from the farm. Passports confiscated, cell phones confiscated, locked in at night, being watched, families threatened. That would be a harboring situation. Or we see it in hotels, motels, and increasingly Airbnbs, because there's less accountability there, where people are brought for days at a time or weeks at a time, maybe, to be sold for sex. So that's harbored. Sometimes people are moved, but please know that they're not always, and it's not part of the definition necessarily. So sometimes people are trafficked out of their own home. Remember that first example that I gave with the 8-year-old kid? Doesn't have to be movement, but sometimes there is. People are brought to where the demand is. So I live up in the mountains in a ski resort community. On any given weekend in the winter, we've got about 250,000 tourists. People want to buy sex, and they want their foods cooked for them and their rooms cleaned. People are brought up to be trafficked for both labor and sex. So they're moved along I-70. Also, rural highways. We've got a great deal of them here. Colorado State Patrol tells us that they pull people over all the time that are moving humans on these rural Colorado highways. Sometimes people are provided, that's like I provide access to my kid in exchange for rent, maybe drugs, something like that. So those are the possible actions. The means are force, fraud, or coercion. Force is physical force, that one's easy to picture. Fraud are these fraudulent promises. I've got this great job, I'll love you forever, right? Coercion is this incredibly powerful tool. So do this or I'll make your 6-year-old sister do it. Do this or I'll have your parents arrested. Do this or they'll arrest you. No one's gonna believe you, right? Do this or I'll take this video that I have of you being compromised in some way, maybe assaulted, and I'll put it all over Facebook. I'll send it to your parents and your priest. Everyone will know, right? So people are being coerced even via text. They don't need to be locked up anywhere. The big star there, though, is to remind us that if they're minors engaging in commercial sex, there does not have to be force, fraud, or coercion, right? That's an exception. The means the purpose, is commercial. At its core, trafficking is about profit. So someone is profiting off of someone else's sex work or labor. Again, it could be money, could be financial. Labor is easy to monetize because we have minimum wage laws. When it comes to sex work, it could be anything of value. So it could be money, could be drugs, could be a bus ticket, could be a place to stay for the night, could be food. Trading anything of value. That's what often differentiates it from other crimes. So there has to be that commercial component. So these are the push factors that are pushing people into this precarity. I think I've covered most of this, pretty well. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. But one thing that I want to note is that people who end up being trafficked aren't stupid. They're not deviant. They're making really solid choices based on their survival needs. They don't have what they need. They don't have love, real love, healthy love, parental or otherwise. They don't have a place to stay. They don't have a good job. They can't access the formal economy for some reason. Maybe they've got a felony on their record and no one will hire them. Maybe they've got a misdemeanor prostitution charge and no one will give them housing. Maybe they've just never known healthy love, because they've never had it modeled for them. And someone steps in and offers them the thing that they need, right? These things on the right side of the screen. These very normal things that we all want. We all want this stuff, right? So sometimes these relationships appear consensual, and in many cases they are. Some parts of the relationship are consensual. And so it's hard for us to parse it out. Like, it looks like they're together. They seem like a happy couple or whatever. Or it seems like a parental-child relationship. It looks that way because it is to some extent. Those parts are consensual, but no one consents to the exploitation. No one consents to being sold 12 times a day for no money or forced to work in a field for 18 hours with no food or water. No one consents to that. So even when parts of the relationship are consensual, there's that power dynamic. That person's not leaving. The reason they're not leaving is because if they left, they would be homeless, or they fear losing their children, or they fear being arrested. It's not because they're desperate to stay. So we've got to do better, right? We've got to figure out a way to meet individuals' needs so that the traffickers don't or can't. We've got to find a way to interrupt this cycle. Okay, so I won't spend too much time here because everyone already knows this, but trafficking, I mean, COVID made everything worse, right? So that includes trafficking. So we had like a 40% uptick to the Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline over the pandemic that hasn't gone back down. People who were already being trafficked continued to be, right? 50 million people being trafficked on any given day. The traffickers weren't like, hey, there's a pandemic on, go home, be safe, you know? They were like forcing people to work still, right? In both sex and labor. People were still buying sex in March of 2020, believe it or not. I know sex workers that were being forced to wear masks while they were being bought and sold, which makes no sense, but whatever. We also had all of this heightened risk, right? So many people out of work, people losing their homes. We had an eviction moratorium, but the overwhelming majority of evictions are informal. Someone can just take off her front door and say, get out, right? If they're the landlord. So those kinds of things were happening. That's a perfect storm for a trafficker. Everyone went online, also where the traffickers went. So traffickers said, well, everyone's online. Well, I guess I got to change my tactics. I'm going to start recruiting online. So we have a known, documented uptick of online recruitment over the pandemic as well. And then everything got disrupted. You know, the law enforcement officers in this space know this best. You know, we defunded the police in Colorado, and the negative effect was we had a mass exodus of law enforcement from our state. Hundreds and hundreds of officers. So most law enforcement agencies are operating at 75 to 85% of capacity right now. They're not training new officers on human trafficking. They're not sending their entire staff to human trafficking trainings, right? Kids weren't in school, so those normal pathways away from exploitation were cut off. Kids weren't in school, hospital systems were, you know, busting at the seams. So all of those professionals who've been trained to recognize this were distracted, right? Not a good situation for trafficking. Why Colorado? I'm not talking about human trafficking in Colorado because it only happens here, you know? I don't want you leaving here being like, oh my goodness, like the trafficking problem in Colorado is so bad, but like it's fine in Kansas. Like it's not, you know, like trafficking happens everywhere. It happens in every state. Every state has vulnerabilities. Every state has highways. Every state has industries that could lend themselves to exploitation. But we're talking about Colorado because that's where we're at, and this is where we can make the biggest difference, right? Most of these things on the screen I've already talked about, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but these are just some of the factors that are specific to Colorado that can add to potential exploitation. The highways, including the rural highways, marijuana grows. We've legalized marijuana in the state, but we've got a lot of illegal grows as well, and we've had several cases of labor trafficking on those illegal grows. Denver International Airport is the only international airport within like a 550-mile radius. People are brought into the airport to be trafficked, through the airport rather, to be trafficked. We've got, sadly, a demand for sex with minors, right? It's shocking to me every single day how many people are willing to buy sex from a 14-year-old, but it's happening, right? And probably some of the law enforcement officers will talk more about that later. But it's also the demand for cheap products that drives this. It's not just the demand for sex. I really encourage you, we're about to be at Halloween, so this is a good time for this conversation, really encourage you to be conscious consumers. Think about where your food is coming from. Think about where your products are being made, because there are some serious issues with child labor, and especially with chocolate as we approach Halloween. There's a website that you can go on right now and take a look at the products that you maybe have already bought, or maybe hopefully not, and whether or not they are involving child slave labor, right? So it's not just chocolate, it's other things like palm oil, but I'm bringing up chocolate because it's Halloween. So I really encourage you, really try to be a more conscious consumer. Sometimes it requires us to spend a little bit more money, but if you have the means to do that, you can be part of the solution. Okay, so this is a tough one, but working on this issue really means asking yourself, who do you think matters? Who deserves our support? Because traffickers are targeting people who belong to marginalized communities, mostly, right? There's always exceptions again, right? They're targeting people like the folks on the right side of the screen here, people engaging in sex work, folks who are undocumented, people who are homeless, kids who run away, people who use drugs. And all of those marginalized communities are marginalized because we stigmatize those choices. We don't like them as a society. And I get that. I don't particularly like all of these things, all of these choices either. But what I do know is that I really care about humans. And I believe that they all deserve access to their basic human rights. No one consents to this stuff. And even when people are forced to make choices that put them in dangerous situations, I still want them to survive. I still want them to be okay. And I hope that you do too. So we've got to figure out a way to bust through our own bias and how we feel about certain populations. So we can support these individuals to find the help that they need, to get out of situations that have put them in precarity, and to survive. Traffickers are counting on us not to. They're specifically targeting these individuals with the hope that we're judging them, we're not seeing them as victims, and we're not offering them the help. And they're mostly getting away with it at this point. So we've got to figure out a way to turn this around. I'll just show you some numbers here, just so you know I'm not making all this up. These are drop in the bucket numbers. That's what I call them. Most people don't self-identify as trafficking survivors. Most people never ask for help. They may or may not get out of their situation. Most of the time, it's not because of some specialized raiding operation by law enforcement. Those do happen, and they're great. And I'm so happy that law enforcement is able to facilitate things like Operation Cross Country or what have you. But those are few and far between. They take a ton of resources. Most of the time, people are coming out of these experiences themselves. They've had enough. They find a way out. They get support. So these numbers just represent the folks who did report, who tried to seek justice through the criminal justice system. FBI, people know that, Colorado Human Trafficking Hotline, Denver DA's office, Denver PD. These are Denver-based, and hopefully Sergeant Bantlin will be able to bring you up to date on Colorado Springs specific numbers. So I'm going to finish off with identification. How are we going to recognize this when it's right in front of us? Because as you know now, because you're experts now, this is not what trafficking usually looks like. If you Google trafficking, this is what comes up. Over-sexualized young females, usually portrayed as white or Asian, and they usually look really scared and innocent. And sometimes they are. I'm not saying this never happens. The problem with this being our only narrative is that if this is the thing we think trafficking looks like, it's the only thing we're ever going to look for. If it's the only thing we ever look for, it's the only thing we're ever going to find. And then it's like a feedback loop. It's the only thing we find, so it's the only thing we think exists, and so it's the only thing we look for. And we are missing it, right? Trafficking looks different than that. People aren't always scared and innocent and crying and asking us for help, right? Sometimes they just look like construction workers, right? So not only are we missing it, but also the victims themselves. They don't see themselves in that common narrative. They don't know that what's happening to them is trafficking, and they don't know who to ask for help or that they will be helped. So they don't, right? So if we expand this definition, if we're more inclusive of what happens to trafficking survivors, then hopefully they'll start coming forward. I think that in order to make an identification, you just also have to know just a little bit about trauma. Trauma affects our brains and our bodies. Everyone who experiences trafficking experiences complex trauma. And it changes the way we behave. We tend to think of it as a small thing. So I want you to just think about driving down I-25 and someone swerves in your car on a snowy day. And what happens to your brain and body? You know what happens. It hurts. It's like adrenaline. You're like, ow, your heart starts beating fast, your pupils dilate, you start sweating a little bit. That's a physical response to a small trauma. Now imagine if that same trauma happened every single minute of every single day. Those same chemicals that are released from your brain when the person swerves into your lane are released into your brain every minute of every day. It changes the way our brains work. So people are experiencing shame and embarrassment or a sense of duty or loyalty to their trafficker because it's their mom or the love of their life as far as they're concerned, right? They mistrust institutions because we failed them so far in the past. They don't think we're ever going to be able to help. And so they refuse our services. They don't ask for help. They're sometimes combative. It's tough. It's hard working in this field. So how are we going to be able to identify this when people are actively pushing back, right? Aside from the trauma, we've also got language barriers, people who don't know their rights, people who've been told that no one's ever going to believe them and that they're going to be criminalized. It's hard. I'm actually going to skip that because I don't have enough time. So I want to make sure that we get to these red flags. So what you can be looking for, and some of these will be relevant to your work, some of them won't. Unexplained injuries. Now, not everyone with an unexplained injury is being trafficked, of course not. You want to be thinking about these as sort of like a list. Like, once I start to see 3, 4, 5 of these, that's when you want your protocol to kick in. That's when you want to start asking some questions. So unexplained injuries, time since injury, evidence of prolonged infection, right? Because healthcare is being withheld. 90% of trafficking survivors will access a healthcare facility at some point during the time they're being trafficked, but usually not until it's really bad, because the trafficker doesn't want them to have that access. So they show up and they should have gotten stitches 2 weeks ago, but never did. Now it's infected, something like that. Malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion, food, water, and sleep is being withheld, right? So that's really common in both sex and labor trafficking situations. Mix that with forced drug use, maybe even someone physically like shooting someone up, and you've got memory loss, psychosis, paranoia, all of these negative mental health outcomes that make survivors even less likely to be believed. Perfect storm for a trafficker. Repeated or frequent STIs, or repeated or frequent abortions. Sometimes tattoos. That would be in a pimp-controlled situation, where a pimp would actually put their name, their street name usually, of course, on the victim via tattoo, maybe with dollar signs or queen's crowns, maybe with the victim's name as well, usually a street name. Look for hand, foot, neck, back tattoos, sometimes more egregious sexual tattoos, that kind of thing. If you want to know about someone's tattoo, just ask them about it. A lot of us have tattoos. If you ask me about my tattoo, I can tell you about it. Even if I hate it, I still have a story. If you ask someone about their tattoo and they look at the ground and say, I can't remember, that's a pretty big red flag. People usually know why they got a tattoo, permanent thing on their body. Behaviorally, someone who doesn't know where they're at, can't articulate where they came from, where they're going to, what hotel they're staying at, where they live. That's important. Someone who doesn't know, like, who has an inconsistent story. So first of all, if someone's telling you something that sounds rehearsed, it probably is. Someone's telling a lie, it doesn't mean they're a liar. They might be lying to protect their trafficker because they love their trafficker. As far as they're concerned, love of their life, right? They might be lying to protect themselves. They've been told that they'd be criminalized. Even if it's not true, they believe that they'll be arrested. Or they're not lying at all. They're just saying things in a non-linear way because they've been so traumatized that they can't remember things or they can't articulate their experience. Someone speaking on behalf of someone else, that's a big one. Happens a lot, especially when a victim is accessing a system. So like in a healthcare setting, again, a trafficker will come into that healthcare setting. Oh, you don't have to get an interpreter. Don't worry, I speak the language, whatever. I'm their cousin. I'm their sister. Talk to me, right? That's a huge red flag and also super problematic. Always, always, always get an interpreter. In the meantime, all of you, one thing you can do is download a cool app. There's a gazillion of them where you can speak into an app and it'll speak out pretty much any language. They're not perfect. They're not meant to be, the only interpreter, but they're a great way to connect with someone. Hey, I just want to let you know you're not in trouble. I want to let you know that I care. I want to make sure you're okay. Is there anything that you need, right? Download those apps. They're amazing. Someone who doesn't have control of their ID, that's a big red flag as well. So we see IDs passports and identification being confiscated, both pimp-controlled situations as well as in labor trafficking situations. That's illegal. If you work for somebody, they can't confiscate your passport. They can take it and make a copy of it and give it back, right? But keeping it is a power move, right? And happens a lot. From a mental health perspective, we see lots of things. Sleep deprivation mixed with substances, co-occurring mental health and substance-related disorders, and just a lot of trauma. So I encourage you to learn more about how trauma affects the brain and how people might behave. For example, paranoia is really common when someone's been traumatized. And it's particularly hard, for me in particular, to help someone when they're like accusing you of being in on it, right? Or they think something that like couldn't possibly be true is true. And we tend to discount those individuals. And I just want to remind you that just because someone is super paranoid doesn't mean they're lying about everything. It might just mean that they've experienced a ton of trauma. Some of what they're saying is true, but they just can't get it out. They just can't articulate everything. One thing I will tell you, if you are a mandatory reporter of child abuse, then you are a mandatory reporter of child sex and labor trafficking. This was a law that we passed in 2016 and went into effect in 2017, making child sex and labor trafficking a mandatory report. So if you're a mandatory reporter of child abuse, mandatory reporter of child sex and labor trafficking in this state, you would just follow your protocols for that. Finally, this is my last slide. Yeah. I want you to know about the hotline. We think this is a resource for all of you, no matter who you are. So this is a statewide human trafficking hotline. It's been around since 2007, believe it or not. Back in the day, back in 2007, we used to get like 30 calls a year. Now we get like 1,000. So it's grown in awareness. It's backed by a 350-strong resource directory. Admittedly, a lot of the resources are concentrated in cities because that's where more resources are. But we have resources from across the state in just about every county. And that's everything from transportation, housing, substance abuse, clothing, food, shelter, many of the organizations that are outside there in our resource directory, right? We all work together on this. So someone could call and just get resources. If the person is a minor who's calling, then we are mandatory reporters, and we do have to report that to law enforcement, just so you know. Either law enforcement or the Department of Human Services, one or the other. We have to mandatory report that. When it comes to an 18 plus, an adult, we do not. So we let that person decide whether or not they want to seek justice through the criminal justice system. We never force anyone to call law enforcement if they're not ready, but we let them know that it's an option. And when we do call law enforcement, we call our trusted and trained law enforcement partners. You have a human trafficking unit here in Colorado Springs, which is amazing. And we know all those individuals on that unit, and we reach out to them specifically. So we're reaching out to someone who we know, who's been trained on this topic, who will respond in a trauma-informed way. So that's an option for you if that's something you're interested in. So it's resources or tips. We also get calls from concerned community members who have a traveling sales crew, young kid who looks malnutritioned and exhausted come to their door and they're worried about that kid's well-being. Something like that. That could be a trafficking situation. We got a lot of those calls. Calls where you saw someone at a supermarket or something like that, right? So if you see something, you can call, and we will report that. We will always send it along to law enforcement if you request us to do so. Not everything ends in an arrest, of course not. And law enforcement takes that and investigates it appropriately, and that's the end of that. But always you can call back. You can always give this number out. Survivors, about 40% of our calls are coming in from survivors directly who are seeking resources. So that's what I've got. I hope I didn't ruin your day. I know it was a heavy way to start the day. So I just say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for just taking the time to turn toward this really challenging topic. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the speakers. Thank you so much for inviting me.
How's that? Can you hear me okay? All right, very good. Well, thank you, Kara. How many feel that you need just kind of a breath of fresh air after that presentation? That was pretty heavy. But I think if you haven't seen anything like that before, that points out just the tip of the iceberg about the complexity and the challenges around human trafficking, without a doubt. So to introduce myself, I'm the MC of the show here I'll be with you for the next couple of hours. Real quick, my background is I'm a retired law enforcement. I did 24 years with the Colorado Springs Police Department. I started in 1998, and 24 years later, here I stand, retired. I had a parallel career with that. Along with that, I was a Colorado National Guard Army officer. In that position, I had a number of positions over at Northcom where I had a kind of a bigger scope and could see some of the other effects that we look at, say, along our southern border. When I started police work in 1998, I would say that I probably approached issues around what we call now human trafficking, was most visible to me in street-level prostitution, interacting with people from our undocumented alien community. When I say undocumented alien community, that's a legal term. A lot of people hear the term thrown around called illegal alien, which is not a recognized legal term. So you really have to make a distinction between our documented and our undocumented, but I would encounter people like that in situations where they had been a victim or they were just interacting with law enforcement, believing that we were going to imprison them, take them back to wherever they came from, when what I had to kind of explain, and many times in Spanish, which I have a base proficiency in, was we're a city police department. We don't enforce immigration law. A lot of communities don't understand that either, both the community at large as well as those immigrant communities. But back to how I interacted initially as a police officer, I would encounter, say, for example, what appeared to be a woman being called in as a suspicious person. Maybe it was cold out, maybe it was late at night, working areas that were known for prostitution. And I approached that as a new police officer. Oh, this is a woman that's addicted to drugs. She's engaged in prostitution, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, you got to move on. That kind of ended there. And then as I began to go to calls, a lot of it started to revolve around the domestic violence incident. Domestic violence incidents, which was actually a prostitution, pimp, human trafficker issue as I started to kind of learn this. This evolution, as with me as a police officer, was all that more difficult because the people that were interacting with me wanted nothing to do with me. They're not going to give me any information. They're not going to say, I'm a victim, I need your help. A lot of times I think people that are involved in this kind of work think that you're going to step forward and say, I'm here to help, and the person who is a victim is going to say, oh, thank you so much, I've been waiting for you. It doesn't happen. In fact, many times that initial interaction is hostile. And that's a real challenge. Now, as I started to interact, I kind of began to get this, there's something more here I'm not seeing. As I started to begin those rapport with people that were, as I would involve and find them in a street level situation, there's more going on here. There's an addiction, there's a trauma, there's a domestic violence cycle. You know, when I came on as a police officer in 1998 and we would respond to a domestic violence incident, it was okay, y'all need to quit hitting each other and somebody needs to go spend the night somewhere and somebody's going to get a ticket for something, you got to go to court later. And then we'd all go away. And we probably killed a lot of people doing that, both men and women. And so we saw the evolution of domestic violence investigations. As I leave the police career, I now know from interactions with people that say, well, I'm going to argue with my significant other, but I am not going to touch them. Not going to happen. Because I know the first one to throw the first punch goes to jail. It's mandatory arrest. It's not I show up and I think one person wants to sign a complaint against the other. No, it's a shall. If I see that incident, I shall arrest. And so, yes, people go to jail. And that has created a deterrent in that one small community to some effect. And that's been a positive overall. Back to the issues of what we see in areas around prostitution or people who are victims of prostitution. And that is, now there's a growing community movement that we say, this isn't just someone who decided to go out one day and engage in this activity. There's a history of trauma, of chemical issues of dependency. So now I can say that as I transitioned through my police career, I went from, say I was the uniformed police officer, and I would participate as a uniformed police officer in what they call the takedown team. There'd be say a female detective, plain clothes, in a given area of the city who would be approached by Johns or people wanting to engage in prostitution. There would be a signal, and I and other officers would be called in and say, hey, go contact the driver of the red Chevy or this car or that car because they were engaged in this activity. The other realization I had as a police officer is that the buyers in this case, and in my preconceived idea of what this industry looked like, it was, they're going to be kind of people that are that rough kind of street people, kind of engaged in that activity. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was completely across the spectrum. There were people of wealth, people who were day laborers, there were people of all spectrum and ethnicities. There was not. Here's the other part about it. It was male-driven. So they were the ones with the demand for commercial sex. Challenged about that. One of the things I looked at is, in interacting is, why are you here? Why are you looking for commercial sex? Really challenging, began to break my paradigm about this industry, and certainly when I interacted with women in this situation, my initial, back in the late 90s, early 2000s was, well, you get a ticket and that's that. But as I started to listen to them, I started to hear more and more about, I can't go home, I'll be beaten, I'm really struggling with alcohol, I'm struggling with narcotics. At that time, it was just a ticket, and it's like, well, I can't, well, that's it. What I can say I saw in the transition was not unlike the change in thinking we saw with domestic violence. We, and I can speak as a senior officer, no longer look at a woman who is victimized by prostitution and in that cycle to say, this is just a simple choice. Where's the victimization? That begins another conversation. It's a difficult conversation, and a lot of times it can't happen from the guy with the blue shirt and all the football gear. As much as I want to be empathetic and nice, there's a barrier. And so what I have to do is reach out to those community groups, those nonprofits, those NGOs that can bring in and provide that joint support for that person. Now, some of the things, as I began my police career, I began to see the crossover between commercial sex exploitation and labor trafficking. Speaking once about an investigation I was on, I was working with the human trafficking detectives. I again was that takedown officer with the uniform that would come in after the plainclothes officers went in, but this was a massage parlor. And it wasn't one of these massage parlors that you think about in the seedy part of town and you never see it, that kind of thing. Nope, it was on Powers Boulevard. You could see it driving every day. In this case, what happened was we had a tip reported. There was illegal activity, prostitution activity, and we believed it was also potentially a labor trafficking situation. So the plainclothes detective went in, posed as a buyer. The detective gave the signal to come in, and we came in and we placed everybody in custody. So then the detectives come in behind us and they start to piece through what's going on. Turns out that the woman who was the person that's the victim of prostitution that accepted the offer for prostitution services to the detective was actually a Mexican immigrant. She had just come up from Mexico with her family. They were actually living in a hotel not far from there with her husband and kids. She had actually been hired as just an appointment setter. Pretty quickly after she began that position, they said, no, you're actually going to do some massages now. And the owners of that parlor, that massage parlor, were connected to the cartels. So they said to her, well, yes, you will provide additional services also. And oh, by the way, if you don't do this, we're going to tell your husband back at the hotel, and we're going to tell your family back in Mexico. And then you're going to be deported. So we had multiple things going on where this person was trapped into what looked like sex trafficking, which included labor trafficking, which included immigration issues. So you could see, putting yourself in the shoes of this person, that where do you go? What do you do? I want to feed my children. I don't want to be shamed in my community. And it's heart-wrenchingly difficult at times. Thankfully, that situation worked through. The investigation occurred. She was then able to work through the immigration side to get a trafficked, basically a victim of a crime, where that person was able to receive services. And the last I heard was in a good space. That's that integrated ability to do those things that I saw. Now, with that, I want to go ahead and, as we begin to go through our speakers, keeping in mind we're going to have a board panel that will be up here, so please hold your questions till the end. But I'd like to thank our sponsors. Oh, good, I got rid of that picture. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Zonta the Pikes Peak, LexisNexis Cares, as well as Lead Group Consulting. These people are in large part what enables a lot of the volunteers to be able to do what they do. So please keep them in mind, and at some point if you interact with some of these folks, give them our heart-warm thanks very much. Okay, about us, the task force. The Human Trafficking Task Force of Southern Colorado is a grassroots nonprofit organization based here in Colorado Springs. If you're not familiar with it, we have monthly meetings, we have a number of different services, and if you're looking to get involved in any way with this community, by all means, please join with us. All right, our vision. Our vision is to end modern-day slavery in Southern Colorado. Our mission is to be involved in preventing labor and sex trafficking through awareness and advocacy, intervening in the human trafficking cycle through collaboration with individuals, agencies, and organizations, and connecting those impacted by modern-day slavery to restorative services. And what we do. Our task force carries out its missions through monthly meetings, as I said, second Tuesday of every month. Please check our website. We're transitioning our location, but we'll be continuing those meetings. Community presentations, this symposium, a diversion program, and survivor support. Now, I want to introduce our task force board. Ms. Joanne O'Neill, if you could just be recognized there. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Good morning. I'm Joanne O'Neill. More than 15 years ago, a group of women came together to think about a way to address human trafficking. One of those women, Betty Edwards, decided to take on the challenge and run with it. At the time, she had no idea about the positive impact she would have on this community and the state of Colorado. She never dreamed that she would still be having symposiums all these years later. Over the last 15 years, we have networked with other groups, we have helped survivors, we have educated thousands on what human trafficking is and how we can stop it, just to name a few. Betty decided to pick up a sword and attack this problem and never wavered. We need more Betty Edwards. Betty would tell you that she's just an ordinary person. I would tell you that she may be ordinary, but she has done extraordinary things. We need all of you to pay it forward. We need all of you to join us in this fight. We need all of you day and night to pick up a sword and attack this problem with the passion of Betty Edwards. I want to give a special shout out to the Zonta of the Pikes Peak region, a few who are here today, including myself. Without these women coming together with Betty and recognizing this horrific problem, we would not be here today. Every day and all day, the women of Zonta take up the sword and fight for justice all around the world. Some of these women are here today, and I would like to recognize them for their passion to make the world a better place.
So at this time, I'd like to introduce Jennisue Jessen. Where does the responsibility for justice for survivors lie? Jennisue Jessen is going to challenge us with the thought that it begins with you and me. With more than 25 years of experience in the field of human trafficking, Jennisue knows the depths of trauma a body can endure. She was sold into the sex trade at age 4 by her grandfather, but God provided her rescue and escape after a failed suicide attempt at 17. Jennisue holds a PhD in educational leadership and is the founder and CEO of Compass 31, an international counter-trafficking NGO. Jennisue is also the creator of Echoes of... Did I lose it? She's also the creator of Echoes of Eden Collective, a social enterprise that funds her charitable work through a vegan, artisanal, eco-friendly skincare line. In 2021, Jennisue was appointed by President Trump to serve on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, where she utilizes her experience to help inform federal counter-trafficking policy. Before she starts, please remember we're asking you to hold your questions till the end, and she will also be participating in the board.
This one. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kara, for your informative presentation as well. Human trafficking in all of its dark brutality is a desecration of everything that is beautiful, holy, and good. Freedom, on the other hand, is knowing our identity and knowing our worth, our purpose, and even our magnificence. This kind of freedom echoes in our souls, calling out from eternity to eternity about what is possible. Pain may be your or our individual and collective origin stories, but pain is not our destiny. When we choose instead to be equipped by our trauma, we can create lives of freedom, joy, and purpose. Lives lived with this kind of passion have the capacity to inspire a movement that is contagious, exponential, and transformative. You already heard enough about me. I'm Jennisue Jessen. I am a survivor leader. I serve on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, and I'm excited to be with you this morning. I'm going to just briefly talk about 3 different things: child sexual exploitation, consumer demand, and personal responsibility. Forgive me for turning around. I'm just making sure my slides are working with me. So first, let's talk briefly about child exploitation. You may or may not be familiar with a term called CSAM, C-S-A-M, which stands for Child Sexual Abuse Material. And while child sexual abuse material is distinct from child exploitation, there is a significant overlap that I would like to address just briefly. Like many survivors of domestic minor sex trafficking, my trafficker generated multiple streams of revenue through my exploitation. For example, first, he profited just from the exchange of handing me over to perpetrators for sexual abuse. But during the crimes, he would take photos or videos of the crimes committed against me, and he would use those images to blackmail the perpetrators. When the perpetrators then refused to pay money to conceal those images, my grandfather, my perpetrator, would sell those images on the black market. In that way, he had 3 streams of revenue through one act of violence. First, the rape itself, then blackmailing the perpetrator, then selling the crime scene photos on the black market. And my story is not unique, unfortunately. It is often the norm for children who are being exploited. So our world is at a critical and unprecedented juncture in which CSAM, child sex abuse material, is at an all-time high. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received approximately 29 million reports of CSAM, compared to 17 million in 2019. Similarly, from January to September of 2021, Instagram removed 4,797,100 posts for child nudity and sexual exploitation. That is 1.5 million more than in the entire year previous. As these numbers have grown, so too have tips specific to child sex trafficking, up 36% from 11,798 in 2019 to 16,032 in 2021. Now, again, we acknowledge that the reports of sex trafficking are lower than those of other crimes. This research indicates that actual victimization is actually significantly higher. As Kara alluded to, very few survivors or children and adults experiencing sexual exploitation will identify as such and feel safe enough to disclose what is happening to them. So let's look briefly at what we view as the trajectory of online sexual exploitation of children. What we see here is human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. The vast majority of children and adults in America access the internet daily. Technology is rapidly being developed and used for online sexual exploitation of children. Online recruitment is the #1 method used to lure individuals into sex trafficking globally. We also find that 1 in 4 children will go on to meet a stranger in person that originally contacted them online. So we can look at this trajectory as when people get involved, when they get educated, ultimately we end up in a world characterized by, when people get involved, then it's the de-escalation of CSAM right here on this picture behind me. They are informed as to what's happening. They are taking effective prevention measures. Justice is being meted out in consistent ways, and the community is involved. Then we see a world where children receive effective prevention and support and avoid sexual exploitation. So the trajectory represents a de-escalation of CSAM when communities are educated and get involved versus an escalation from where we are when communities are blind to the way perpetrators are luring and interacting with our children online, do not get involved, normalize the sexual abuse of children, then we end up with a world characterized by rampant sexual exploitation of children and adults. So how are we doing in Colorado? How are we doing in Colorado? Shared Hope International every year puts out grade cards, state by state, rating how we are doing in criminal justice specific to child and youth sexual exploitation. So here's our 2021 Colorado grade card. You see we get a B in criminal provisions. That's our high score. And that is because, again, like Kara referred to, in Colorado, minors can no longer be arrested on prostitution-related charges. However, so we get a high score here. However, 19 states in the U.S. still allow for minors to be arrested for prostitution-related charges. The latest statistics that we have access to from the Department of Justice indicate that in 2019, 290 children were still arrested for prostitution charges. 40 of those were children ages 10 to 14. So Colorado gets a good grade, B, for criminal provisions, but look at the rest of our grade card. We get an F for identification and response to victims. We get an F for continuum of care for children identified and not cared for in a consistent way. We get a C for access to justice, so that's, middle of the road, not terrible. A D for tools for victim-centered criminals response, and an F for prevention and training. So our overall grade as a state right now is a D, which means we have lots of room for improvement. So let's talk briefly about consumer demand. As Chris and Kara both alluded to, demand drives sex trafficking and labor trafficking. What does that have to do with you and I? Well, let's start with sexual exploitation first. In December 2002, the White House issued a national security presidential directive. This is NSPD 22. That serves as a foundational resolution towards protecting human dignity and eradicating commercial sexual exploitation. You can read it behind me. NSPD 22 states that the United States government opposes prostitution and any related activities, including pimping, pandering, maintaining brothels, as contributing to the phenomenon of trafficking in persons. These activities are all inherently harmful and dehumanizing. The United States government position is that these activities should not be ever regulated as a legitimate form of work for any human being. Now, 20 years after the release of this pivotal commitment towards justice, there is a growing trend to legalize prostitution that is gaining momentum nationwide. Some advocates argue passionately that prostitution is a legitimate field of work and a viable way to provide economic empowerment to underserved and marginalized communities. For example, the Open Society Foundation argues that decriminalization promotes safe working conditions, reduces the risk of spreading sexually transmitted infections, and helps prevent abuse. They are quoted as saying, when sex work is decriminalized, sex workers can press for safer working conditions and use the justice system to seek redress for discrimination and abuse. The group also says sex workers are more likely to live without stigma, social exclusion, or fear of violence. I think it's important to bring these thoughts and questions forward, these arguments forward, so that we have a well-balanced view of what's happening in our culture, our society, and why these arguments are so significant. Bills to decriminalize sex work are being considered right now in New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Missouri, prompting concerns that the nature of the industry will lead to an increase in trafficking. Many of these efforts actually include the full decriminalization of pimping, operating brothels, and paying for sex. Full decriminalization, therefore, undermines the ability of law enforcement to actively investigate and effectively ascertain whether children or adults are being victimized in prostitution. Even the modification of Colorado's laws that downgraded penalties for solicitation for prostitution and changed prostitution to a petty offense makes it significantly more difficult to assist those victimized and provide them with services that they need. A decade of experience with legalization and full decriminalization in countries like Germany and the Netherlands has taught us that these approaches do not effectively reduce harm, stigma, or violence, nor do they improve working conditions for those exploited. Rather, they dramatically increase the demand that drives commercial exploitation. Evidence examining legalized prostitution in 150 countries has found that marginalized communities experience higher rates of trafficking, higher inflows and outflows of trafficking to meet the greater legalized demand. I'm going to skip this one for now, maybe. There we go. The same holds true wherever increasing demand for cheap products and cheap labor are normalized as part of the economic system. In the United States, labor traffickers exploit and subjugate both foreign nationals and U.S. citizens. Labor trafficking victims in the United States and abroad produce some of the food we eat and manufacture some of the clothes that we wear. They cultivate the fields that we drive past every day, and they clean the buildings in which many of us work. Globally, it is estimated that there are approximately 27.8 million trapped in human trafficking. This is outside of those in forced marriage. So this is for labor, the labor piece of trafficking statistics. 17.3 million victims of labor trafficking are in private industry. 4.8 million are in sexual exploitation, and 3.9 million are in state-imposed forced labor. As of June 23rd, 2021, the Department of Labor has identified 156 goods from 77 countries made by forced and child labor. So the unfortunate reality is that adults and children in forced labor in the United States and globally are exploited in supply chains to meet our own personal demands for cheap labor and for cheap products. It is the consumers that drive the demand and the consumers that provide the profit incentive for traffickers. Traffickers follow the money that flows from our own pockets. To effectively interrupt trafficking, we must acknowledge the ways in which we as individuals have been complicit in these crimes, and we must recognize that justice for all begins with you and with me. Policies and programs must be grounded in the best possible understanding of the root causes of trafficking, including consumer demand at local, regional, national, and global levels. This remains critically important because human trafficking operates according to the economic principles of supply and demand. One common thread between a person being commercially exploited and the trafficker profiting from them is that neither would exist if it were not for consumer demand. Despite the enactment of criminal laws on human trafficking, statistics indicate that a number of investigations, prosecutions, and convictions is very, very small in scale to the overall problem. This means that criminal law enforcement needs to be intensified, particularly in response to companies and corporations that profit from forced labor, pimps exploiting individuals in commercial sex, and sex buyers. It is equally important to strengthen law enforcement response to apply sanctions for the offenders and remedies for those exploited. But we must also concurrently undertake an extensive public education campaign to ensure that citizens like you and I understand the elements of forced labor and how they may be present within the supply chain of the products that we purchase and the services that we pay for. Here's the thing, both labor and sex trafficking are driven by consumer demand. Consumers provide the profit incentive. We as individual consumers must acknowledge the ways that we are complicit. For example, are you aware of how your coffee is farmed? How about how your shrimp is harvested? Who is mining the cobalt for the batteries in your electric vehicle? Did you know that batteries for electric vehicles require cobalt, and that 3/4 of the world's cobalt supply is located in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Did you know that tens of thousands of children are being sent underground and subjugated to brutal forced labor so that the privileged can drive green vehicles? And what about pornography that is so carelessly consumed? Do you know how many of those images were created through force, fraud, coercion, or rape? Friends and colleagues, you and I must accept responsibility for our own greed and our own lust that demands our desires are met at the expense of and through the exploitation of another human being. Justice for all, friends, begins with you, and it begins with me. We must learn to evaluate the products we consume and become accustomed to asking, who made this and under what conditions? The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass reminds us, no man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck. The lives of those who overcame slavery and went on to change the world both educate and inspire us to act. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman are only a few among a great many heroes of generations past who courageously used their own experiences to give voice to the atrocities of slavery. They were each victimized, and yet they were not defeated. The brutal details and the raw humanity of their lives serve as a reminder both of how far we as a nation have come and how much further we have to go to obtain the freedom of which they dreamed. While slavery was formally abolished in the U.S. with the passing of the 13th Amendment on December 18, 1865, millions of people are still falling prey to human trafficking by means of force, fraud, and coercion. Those that have survived exploitation, past and present, have seen the worst of humanity and the best of humanity. And their experiences have informed change. It is with great humility, therefore, that I carry the echoes of their voices forward in my own. Collaboration and survivor engagement must be the foundational basis for our national, state, and local efforts if we are to have any hope of ever ending the scourge of commercial exploitation through human trafficking. The world bears witness to our collective action or inaction. Nelson Mandela once said, "It is in your hands to create a better world for all who live in it." Therefore, I ask the stakeholders, the NGOs, and each of you, concerned citizens present today, that you integrate this knowledge into your individual and our collective efforts to combat trafficking, and in doing so, create a more just world for all, because justice begins, friends, with you and with me. If you're interested in connecting with me further, that QR code, if you know how to use a QR code, is my contact information. And I have a table over in the corner and would be happy to connect. Thank you.
As we begin this next presenter, one of the significant events of the past 15 years has been the implementation of the Colorado Human Trafficking Council through the Governor's Office. And at this time, it's our honor to welcome Christian Gardner-Wood, JD, the Chief Deputy District Attorney of Community Protection and Legislative Affairs for the Boulder County District Attorney's Office. He has been a prosecutor for 15 years. As the Chief of Community Protection, he oversees the prosecutions in the DA's office involving at-risk victims, elder victims, significant economic crimes, and also oversees community outreach and policy initiatives for the office. His passion is community engagement in prosecuting crimes involving vulnerable populations. He has prosecuted and trained extensively in the areas of elder abuse, mandatory reporting, child abuse, sex offenses, and human trafficking. He has been the district attorney representative to the Colorado Human Trafficking Council for 6 years and has been chair of the council for 4 years. So once again, hold your questions till the panel, and welcome Christian.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be able to speak. The Southern Colorado Human Trafficking Symposium is always an important yearly event that's held in our state as part of our anti-trafficking movement here in the state of Colorado, and it's my honor to be able to speak with you. I was asked to talk today a little bit about the Colorado Human Trafficking Council and the work of that council. As was just noted by Chris, I've had the honor of serving on the Colorado Human Trafficking Council through governor appointment since 2017. About a year later, I was elected by the membership of that council to be the chair and have been reelected again about a year and a half ago, and am on my second term as being chair of the council for about the last 4 years. In that role, I oversee the council meetings, do planning around council activities, run the meetings, and in some ways serve as the voice of the council, thus you all getting to listen to me this morning to talk about some of the work that the council's doing in conjunction with our strong partners with the Division of Criminal Justice as part of the state of Colorado, who works as the ones that are the staff to our council. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done over the last several years since the council was implemented, what the membership looks like, some of our guiding principles that we have from statute. So first, looking at the duties and responsibilities that we have. The council was created by statute, and I need to turn on this because I wander. Hopefully this will work. It was created by state law in 2015 with duties of training across the state, doing prevention efforts, creating standards as part of different areas, so housing standards, we'll talk about some of those, victim services standards, collecting data, looking for funding opportunities. So as many of you that work with state agencies and state funding streams are probably aware, there wasn't much funding given. It was saying you should go out and do training, you should do prevention, you should do public awareness, which is great, but there wasn't a lot of funding. So they basically said, do these things, these are important, but find funding opportunities to do them. And we'll talk a little bit about how we've been able to do some of that here shortly. Creating those training curriculum as well as best practices that we have, and then recommending statutory changes in Colorado state law as it relates to human trafficking prevention. So those are some of the guiding principles that we were given by our enabling statute from the General Assembly back in 2015. A couple other things that we do hold monthly meetings. 11 months of the year, we take off December around the holidays, but 11 months of the year on the fourth Friday, typically, of every month, the Colorado Human Trafficking Council meets. Those are open to the public, so I've talked to some people this morning who want to get more information, want to be more involved, and one of those ways is to do some work and volunteer with the Division of Criminal Justice anti-trafficking efforts, as well as the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. We always have opportunities for public comment in addition to public participation. The nice thing as well is we used to be entirely in person. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this. Prior to the pandemic, we didn't really know how to do hybrid or virtual meetings. We pivoted with the pandemic, and although we do have still in-person meetings that the public is able to attend, we now have kept that hybrid option, which I really appreciate, to continue public engagement with this and make it easier for people across the state of Colorado to be able to be engaged in some of this work. As part of the work that we do, we also do annual reports. So if you go on to the Colorado Human Trafficking Council's website, you'll see every year's annual report going back to 2015 when we were created as a statewide board and commission. That report is delivered to the General Assembly every January, but also released to the public. So although by statute we have to create that report for Colorado state legislators, it's really designed as a public document when we draft it, and we do release it publicly. So if you're interested in information, you can get that. There's also a monthly newsletter, the Colorado Anti-Trafficking Insider, that provides information about what's happening on a monthly basis in the anti-trafficking efforts in the state of Colorado, not just with the council, but also with some of the task forces. So sometimes we'll push out information from the Southern Colorado Task Force that is our gracious host this morning for this symposium. So looking generally at what the Colorado Human Trafficking Council does, it's about bringing together leadership from the community to address this issue of trafficking in our state and to prevent that and do prosecution around that. So it's bringing together kind of those statewide efforts, both at the community level, the local task force level, and statewide, to really bring those experts to the table to figure out what are we doing as a state, what can we do better, what are the next steps that we may be missing in terms of the anti-trafficking movement. So it's enhancing that collaboration, comprehensive services for victims and survivors, and assisting for successful prosecution. Obviously, my role as a prosecutor previously in the Jefferson County DA's office when I was a full-time human trafficking prosecutor, and now continuing in my role as one of the chief deputies at the Boulder County DA's office, and general prevention efforts. So what does that look like? It's legalistic language, as our state statutes always are. It's 35 members that are either appointed by the governor of the state. The vast majority are appointed by governor appointment, including myself. So even though I serve as a representative for statewide district attorneys, that's through an appointment previously by Governor Hickenlooper and then reappointment by Governor Polis for 4-year terms that we serve as council members. But with that, it's State Judicial Department. We have a judge from Weld County who serves as the representative. She's appointed by the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court. We have some executive director appointments, so the Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture. The executive director of those state departments appoints somebody, but I'd say probably about 25 of those appointments are through governor appointment in the state of Colorado. So again, Judicial Department, DAs, defense attorneys, human services workers, both at the state and local level. So we have individuals that are part of the State Department of Human Services, but also folks that are more on the ground doing this work in County Department of Human Services. So we have folks from the Executive Director's Office at the State Human Services Department. We also have an executive director from both an urban and rural department, County Department of Human Services, and caseworkers. Right now we have a great caseworker that sits on the council from Larimer County who really does this work on a day-to-day basis and brings their expertise. You heard earlier from Kara Napolitano, a great expert in this area from the state of Colorado. Her executive director from the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking has been with the council serving in that role for a long time. Joanne O'Neill, who you heard from, who is part of the Human Trafficking Task Force of Southern Colorado. She has served as a representative from a local task force to the statewide council and has been a great partner of ours for many years, really since the inception of this council, to talk about what are efforts happening at the local task force levels that we should do at the statewide level. Going further, we also have domestic violence advocates, child advocacy center folks that are on that council, sexual violence advocates that are on that because of, as Kara talked about earlier, that cross-section of human trafficking when we think about child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual abuse really all intersect in many ways in this area of human trafficking. So bringing all of those experts together to try and fight this problem as a state. So I talked a little bit about our annual report. Again, there's a treasure trove of information. I don't expect anybody to go through and sit down for any kind of nice bedtime reading material to read that 100 pages. But if you are looking for specific information about the work of the council or about anti-trafficking efforts in Colorado, I certainly would encourage you to go onto the website and take a look. You can look at the different sections so you're not having to just scroll through the entire report. One of the areas, though, that people are really interested in on a yearly basis is our stats as a state. And one section going all the way back to 2015 is our data section. That's required by that state law that enabled us as a board and commission in the state that we always have to collect data and report out to the state on that data. So what you see here is kind of a combination of some of the areas where we collect data. If you look, we have Department of Justice investigations at the federal level. We have both federal and state investigations done through the Homeland Security Investigations Unit. We have state judicial cases here in the middle that are actually filed in the state courts of the state of Colorado. We have the FBI's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force within the metro area. down here, and then over on the right, kind of recoveries and arrests, and then investigations and arrest over on the right. So looking at some of these numbers, you see that if you go back all the way to 2015, you'll see that because we really started to do a concerted effort in the anti-human trafficking movement in the state of Colorado, those numbers were increasing for many years from 2015 through 2019, going back through all of our annual reports. And we've really become a leader in the nation in terms of the anti-trafficking movement nationwide. Colorado has really been trying to be at the forefront of some of that work. What you'll see through some of these various statistics, though, similar to a lot of other areas in the state, and I imagine some of you that are associated with organizations saw as well, is we then saw a decrease in 2020 with the pandemic then impacting things. So we saw that in areas of domestic violence reporting, we saw that in areas of child abuse reporting, sex abuse reporting, and certainly in terms of human trafficking. One of the things Kara talked about is we're still getting the reports, we're still getting calls to the hotline, people wanting information, providing information about investigations, but the ability to act on those, I think, was limited during the pandemic, quite unfortunately, just as a lot of our society was limited during that time frame. So you see, as we continue to go through those numbers, those decrease, that we were seeing some increases and then a decrease in 2020. I was really hoping to see an increase in some of our prosecutions and investigations for 2021. We just spent, and there's a couple council members in the room today, we spent about 4 hours yesterday as a council going through the data, and what we actually see is those numbers haven't rebounded through 2021. So we're always a year behind in our reporting, so that's why right here I'm talking about 2020. This year's annual report will talk about the full year of 2021, so we're always a year behind, but really trying to increase those efforts, get back to those pre-pandemic numbers that we saw, because we know it's still happening, right? Of course, I'd love to see these numbers as zero. That's obviously the goal. But we know that we're not at that place. We know that we're not at a situation, I should maybe stop walking around because I always create problems, but I can't help it. We know that it's happening, so as much as I'd love to see these numbers be zero, it's important that we are doing these investigations. It's important that we are doing these prosecutions as a state to take that stand in the anti-trafficking movement to make sure that we're doing what we can on all different fronts to combat human trafficking. So again, an important area that I think a lot of people are interested in our annual reports about in terms of that data section, and this is just a little subset of that. It goes much more in depth. We have numbers in terms of reporting to human services, the number of screens that are done by human services of various youth in terms of doing a screening device to make sure that they're not human trafficking victims, or if they are at risk to be human trafficking victims, based on some of the key indicators that Kara talked about earlier this morning, that we're providing intervention before they fall prey to a trafficker or are in a situation where they're engaged in human trafficking. So then looking at some of the work that we're doing, I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about our statewide public awareness campaign and our training, but some of the other areas, pursuant to statute that created us, we had to create certain standards for the state. So we had to create housing standards for organizations that provided housing for youth that had experienced human trafficking, mental and behavioral health care providers, standards as it relates to providing those services to human trafficking victims, standards for community-based victim advocacy organizations dealing specifically with human trafficking victims. And then just earlier this year, because of really bringing together those 35 experts, which includes law enforcement, I forgot to mention that earlier, very key partner that we have on the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, we became aware that the Colorado Peace Officers Standards and Training, that's at the bottom left there, Peace Officer Standards and Training in the state of Colorado, that they were cutting back some of their human trafficking training requirements. Now, I don't blame them. They have a lot that they have to train law enforcement on, and they have a lot of people chomping at the bit to spend time talking to law enforcement officers about different areas. So that's going to be domestic violence, that's going to be sex abuse, that's going to be violent crimes, gun violence, any number of things, right? So it's a lot law enforcement has to be trained on. Well, as they have these different obligations, they also have obligations based on state law. And as some of the state law obligations, which does not include human trafficking right now, increased, they had other discretionary areas that they had to decrease. Well, what we heard, because the sheriff of Douglas County, who serves as the statewide representatives for county sheriffs of Colorado, told us, hey, I also serve on the post board, and I think you should know as a council, they're minimizing the human trafficking training because of being pulled in different directions. So we were able to take that expertise and take our status as a statewide board and commission to really put some pressure on the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board to say, listen, we understand you have competing interests and a lot of things you need to train on, but you cannot minimize the requirements for law enforcement to know about human trafficking, and this needs to be a part of your training. And so that's some of the areas where it's important to have those folks around the table so we can then have those discussions with the Attorney General's office that oversees the post board and say, let's talk about why this is important. Let's make sure we get this back into your curriculum. Some other areas, just recently we received a federal grant in terms of multidisciplinary teams. So multidisciplinary teams are anything where you bring together a group of individuals to address a problem. So essentially the Colorado Human Trafficking Council is a multidisciplinary team. But what that grant looks at is local multidisciplinary teams, which includes the Southern Colorado Human Trafficking Task Force is a great example of a local MDT that's doing great work. Well, the problem is we have a number of those in the state of Colorado that are doing great work, like the one here in Southern Colorado. There's one in Jefferson County, there's one in Boulder County, one in Denver. But what about the San Luis Valley, right? What about down in Alamosa? What about down in Durango? What about in Mesa County? The problem is when we start looking at some of those areas, they don't have the resources, they don't have a local multidisciplinary team. And so this grant was designed to figure out best practices around multidisciplinary teams and how to make sure that we're enhancing those and making sure that they exist throughout the state of Colorado. So it's not just, Colorado Springs, Denver metro area where these task forces are doing great work, but rather throughout all, 54, 56 counties in the state of Colorado. We also received a grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation in terms of providing information at truck stops and different transportation facilities within the state of Colorado, which is so important when we think about how human trafficking victimization is a transient population, right? And that it's happening at truck stops. It's happening on the rural highways, on the major interstates, as Kara talked about earlier. And it's something where truck drivers, people that are involved in the transportation industry can see that. We're also doing stuff at DIA as well in terms of being an international airport and a hub that people are looking for this. And then importantly, a lot of the work of the council, so we meet a half day once a month as an overall council of 35 members, but then after that meeting, we then go into, for a couple of hours, our task force meetings, which is really where the work gets done. And so where that becomes important is this year we have a legislative task force. We have an underserved populations task force specifically dealing with the needs of survivors that may be in rural communities that don't have the same services that, say, a Colorado Springs or a Denver would have. And then our survivor engagement task force, the importance of being survivor-informed, survivor-driven, making sure that survivors are a part of this conversation at every stage. We have 4 survivor seats that are governor-appointed on the council, and it's important that their voice is on the table, at the table, so that we know from their experience and we can make sure that the stuff we're doing as professionals, as a prosecutor, for example, in my profession, that is being informed by the survivor experience. Because without that, I could think I'm doing a great job. I could think that, I'm a great prosecutor, but I need to know from the person that experienced this in terms of how this impacts where they were, what happened, and what their experience was. A couple of previous task force where there was some really important work was our criminal justice task force, which really talked about the intersection of human trafficking and the criminal justice system, not just from a prosecution of offender standpoint, because of course that happens, right? That's why I'm on the council, honored to be the chair of the council, is prosecuting those offenders that are committing human trafficking. But there's a lot more areas of criminal justice intersection with human trafficking, specifically when we talk about our victims and survivors. A lot of times that trafficking victimization is also a situation where they experience the criminal justice system in a negative way, whether that be because of substance use disorder, sometimes which is fueled by their trafficker, whether that's based on crimes of survival, so theft that's being done as part of surviving in this trafficking victimization, or because their trafficker is having them engage in other crimes as part of their trafficking victimization. At a case years ago in Jefferson County when I was prosecuting there, where this guy was running a human trafficking ring, my trafficker that I prosecuted, but he was also running an auto theft ring. So those trafficking victims, as part of their victimization, they had to go out and steal cars to fuel his other revenue source of auto theft. And so I had these juvenile victims that are getting picked up for motor vehicle theft. And as we started digging further into it, we realized, well, this is happening not because they themselves are juvenile delinquents or criminals, but rather it's being forced upon them through force, fraud, and coercion to have to do this because of their victimization. So that's the area where we really looked at criminal justice intersection and how do we deal with that? Right? We have an affirmative defense in the state of Colorado where a juvenile or an adult defendant could present that information and it could negate their responsibility. But we also need to think about historically, can they seal their records if that happens? Can they vacate their convictions if later on they can show, hey, this happened. I couldn't say anything when I was being prosecuted for it because I was scared, because I was being victimized. But now that I'm a survivor, now that I'm 5 years out from this, you need to know that I was stealing cars because of my victimization, because I was being forced to. So going back and looking and saying, should we as a state provide vacatur of criminal convictions for people that can prove that their criminal activity was due to their victimization as a human trafficking victim through that. So that's some of the work that we're actually taking through the legislative task force this year and proposing legislation to create a vacatur of criminal convictions for human trafficking victims if they meet certain requirements. And that's where the issue, of course, is always in the details when we get to the General Assembly at the start of 2023. But that's certainly something that's important. Also thinking about our survivor engagement and recognizing that as part of my job as a chief deputy in the Boulder DA's office, when I spend an entire Friday at the council meeting, I get my normal salary. But if we have a survivor who is a representative on that council, those 4 survivors, they're probably not in a job that's paying them to be there on that Friday like I have the opportunity to do. And unfortunately in Colorado, individuals that serve on statewide boards and commissions have to do so without compensation, separate compensation from the state. So again, somebody like myself, who it's just part of the work that I do, and so my boss is very supportive of this work that I do and going around the state and being at the council meetings. It's great, part of my salary. But for somebody that isn't in such a position, we need to think about compensation. So that's the other thing we'll be looking at as part of legislation in the 2023 General Assembly session. I said I'd come back to the human trafficking public awareness campaign. So part of what was an issue in our enabling legislation was doing a public awareness campaign, but unfortunately without any funding to do a public awareness campaign. So we spent several years developing a statewide public awareness campaign, but then had to figure out how do we fund it. we were lucky enough to get significant money from the federal government to do a statewide public awareness campaign. So some of you may have seen me in the back of the room with some of the posters and window clings that we have. And I encourage you to check that out before the end of the session today. If there's a place where you feel like those posters are appropriate for you to put up, I encourage you to take as many as you can. There's some window clings, there's some stickers. It takes you to a website called thisishumantrafficking.com. That's not the Human Trafficking Council's website. It's a separate website that's providing information around what is human trafficking, ways to prevent it. And it includes some of the graphics that I have here. You'll see that on the posters in the table that I have in the back. It also includes some of these graphics, and it's different areas of trafficking. So here I have one that's more of a sex trafficking type of circumstance. That's certainly important. Then I have another one that's familial trafficking, both from the sex and labor standpoint. So we wanted to make sure that we were providing the various areas of trafficking and making sure that we did that. One of the things I should have noted is when we started as a council in 2015, I think we did really strong work in our first few years of addressing child sex trafficking. And became a leader nationwide in terms of prosecution and hopefully prevention of child sex trafficking. But what we realized is it created a blind spot in those first few years where we weren't talking about adult sex trafficking, and we absolutely were not talking about labor trafficking. So one of the task forces several years ago was creating a labor trafficking task force so we could really talk about how do we enhance that area, both from a prosecution standpoint, a public awareness standpoint, and a prevention standpoint. Because our first few years, that was something that we hadn't done, and it was important that we're talking about all different types of trafficking, and really those three areas that Kara talked about before: child sex trafficking, adult sex trafficking, and all labor trafficking. Here's a quick video of
you saw
the
me,
public awareness campaign.
or someone like me. You didn't like what you saw. What you didn't see was how he lied to me, made money off me, threatened me, forced me to do things. You didn't see I needed help.
This is human trafficking. It is a crime. If you suspect this is happening to you or someone you know or have seen, go to thisishumantrafficking.com.
So an example of some of the different materials that we've created statewide, we have billboards with this. We have done some of these video spots and commercials. We actually were lucky enough before the Super Bowl in January to get some airtime. We did some stuff during the Olympics in terms of airtime. So really getting this out to folks in the state of Colorado. With those videos, just as I had talked about, we wanted to make sure that we were covering all areas of trafficking. We have about 6 or 7, or maybe even more of those videos. So that one kind of focuses on sex trafficking. We have some specifically that talk about labor trafficking. An area in Colorado where we see that is in the agricultural industry, in the farm hands, where we do that. And so it's twofold. It's really about public awareness generally to make sure that the average member of the public, to Kara's point earlier, recognizes that this isn't Liam Neeson jumping through the roof and coming back to save his daughter, who got shot up with drugs and had no issues before she happened to travel to Europe, right? That's not what it is. Could that be trafficking? Sure. But it's about this much of trafficking that we see in Colorado, in the nation, or even internationally. And so getting people to understand this is happening in Colorado. This is happening in rural and urban communities, poor and affluent communities, and people that look like any of us, you know. And that's important for them to understand. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is also to provide information for victims. So if you go to thisishumantrafficking.com, you'll see that it has that general information, but then it also has information and resources for somebody that is maybe a victim as well. So sometimes the victims don't understand that their experience is trafficking, that they are being trafficked. It takes some recognition of what that is. So it's for the victims. But we're also partnering with individuals, organizations, to be able to talk about what that looks like and provide direct information. So just yesterday we talked about at the council, we used some of the money from the public awareness campaign. We've created some of the information from the campaign on sunscreen bottles that can be handed out to farm workers so they have that information directly. We've also created some lip balms that are more surreptitious things. So the sunscreen actually specifically gives information about human trafficking both in English and in Spanish. The little lip balms can be handed out to somebody that maybe isn't in a safe situation to be able to say that they're being trafficked or even have something on their person that says human trafficking, because if their trafficker finds that, puts them in significant danger. So that lip balm, what it actually has on it is a very small QR code that somebody could scan and go to that website, but that's it. It also has a barcode, which looks like the barcode when you would purchase the lip balm, but that barcode is actually the state human trafficking hotline number. It's that 866 number that Kara talked about earlier that the lab runs and the Network to End Human Trafficking runs. I'd also talked about the training. So there's a couple different training options that we have. There's the introduction. This is kind of a 101 type of training, just general introduction, similar to what you all received, which was fantastic this morning from Kara, in terms of what is human trafficking, what does that look like, what are some of the indicators, what does prosecution look like, how do we prevent it, that sort of thing. Then we also have one specifically for victims, for community-based victim services providers and meeting the needs of human trafficking survivors. So we have that one. And then we have kind of a 101 training specifically for law enforcement in terms of law enforcement investigations regarding this. One thing that we want to do is kind of take this to the next level and get to like a 201 type of law enforcement course. So this one is currently good for your patrol officers, maybe your detectives, but then we want to get to a point of, you know, thinking about the fact that Colorado Springs is great because they do have dedicated human trafficking investigators. How do we provide more information to create more human trafficking investigators? So instead of just giving general information, how do you gain an expertise in this area to where this could be more of your full-time job and doing this from a law enforcement perspective? So I know I was speaking quickly. I had a half an hour. I apologize, but I'll certainly be on the panel. I welcome any questions when we're on the panel, but I did also want to provide my information. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me, call me. I'm always happy to be a resource for anybody across the state to be able to help in any way I can. So with that, I look forward to the panel and some of your questions a little bit later after our next presentation, but I appreciate the time this morning and for all the work that's being done here in Colorado Springs and the southern part of our state. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that presentation. Next, I'm going to have Lieutenant Alan Van Land come up. He'll be doing a presentation. Lieutenant Alan Van Land is the former supervisor of the Metro Vice Unit, the Colorado Springs Police Department, responsible for investigating human trafficking and commercial sex crimes in Colorado Springs and El Paso County. After graduating from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 2002, he cross-commissioned, thank you for your service, sir, he cross-commissioned into the U.S. Marine Corps and served as a logistics officer. He joined the CSPD in 2008 and has worked in patrol, the Crimes Against Children Unit, the Financial Crimes Unit before his promotion to sergeant in 2018. He led the Metro Vice Unit from 2020 to 2022 and has since been promoted to lieutenant at the Gold Hill Division. Lieutenant Van Land.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Chris. Next slide, please. Or actually, I guess I got a clicker here. So I was originally asked to come here and talk about the laws of human trafficking in the state of Colorado, in the city of Colorado Springs, and how we use them as law enforcement officers, and then also like what changes we might want to see in the laws. Because I'm here officially representing CSPD today, and this is not we don't usually go around commenting on laws. Our job is to enforce laws. So I'm just going to talk about what the laws are and how we're using them. And I can't get into my personal opinion on what I would like to see potentially as changes in laws or not. So first off, there's a number of different laws pertaining to prostitution. This is adults only, adult, anything involving juvenile we'll get to here in a second. But adult only, assuming that everything is consensual. You have prostitution, that's what usually would the sex worker traditionally would be charged with. Patronizing, which is actually the buyer going through the act, or soliciting the buyer asking for it, whether they actually went through the act or not. Those were all various classes of misdemeanors in the state of Colorado until the legislature last year revised a number of different criminal laws in the state of Colorado, and one of those revisions was to drop all of those down to petty offenses. And if you're not familiar with crime as a whole, hopefully you're not terribly familiar with it, Colorado has 6 levels of felony crimes. Class 1 felony is your premeditated murder, down to a class 6 felony, which includes a variety of different things it may have changed, but false information to a pawnbroker, class 6 felony. And then you had 3, it's now 2 different levels of misdemeanor crimes, and then you have petty offenses. So a petty offense is a 3rd-degree criminal trespass, which is 1st degree would be a felony. If I walked into someone else's house without their permission and broke into the house without committing a crime, that's a felony. The misdemeanor trespass is if I was hopping into someone's fenced backyard without permission, and a petty offense is walking into someone's unfenced front yard property without their permission. It's usually just like a low-level ticket. But all that changes significantly the second that one of the people involved, well, really the sex worker involved, the sex worker, the victim, and let me be clear on this real quick. CSPD has never arrested a juvenile in the past decade. I can't speak to before that for any sex work related crime. That juveniles are all clearly victims. Whether they cooperate with the investigation or not may make a huge difference as to like the outcome of the case for them, but those are victims to us. We get victim advocates out there. The first time as a sergeant that I put out to the news like, hey, we made an arrest in a child sex trafficking situation, and we arrested such and such person for pimping a child or sex trafficking a child or soliciting for child prostitution. The comments on the articles that came back were like, it's not child prostitution, you can't call that anymore. I get that. I do understand that the wording and everything puts like a blame towards children. However, this is what the law is. Like, that's what it's titled, and it's not up to me to change the title, so that's just what the law is named. But patronizing, actually going through the act, is a class 3 felony, so pretty serious. Soliciting, even just asking for it, not going through the act, exact same severity of crime. And again, on that 1 to 6 scale, it's a 3. I think presumptive sentencing range on that is like 4 to 12 years prison. And that even has written into the law there that it's no defense if they didn't know the child's age or if they reasonably believed the child was 19. She looked 19, she said she was 19. Guess what? You're still getting a class 3 felony. We also use pimping a fair bit. So pimping, and we'll come up with the sex trafficking statute here in a second. They are worded very differently. They both focus kind of on different aspects of the same crime. They're both class 3 felonies. The pimping and the sex trafficking for an adult are both class 3 felonies. And sometimes it's a lot easier to prove one than the other. Particularly, it's sometimes easier to prove pimping for adults. But you'll see that pimping is really a money crime. If someone is knowingly living on or being maintained, living on, in whole or in part, by money or anything else of value received through someone else's sex work. So it requires us to be able to prove that they know that the person's making money through sex work and they're living off of it. The DA's office reasonably wants to see that they're somehow actively encouraging or helping that situation and not just like passively mooching, because, for instance, you could have, say, a parent whose adult daughter is making money through sex work to support herself, and the parents know that and they don't like it, and then the parents' car breaks down and they're like, hey, can you help out? You know, the DA is like, that's not really a pimping situation. But someone who's encouraging that prostitution, helping to take advertisement photos, helping to arrange the dates, helping to drive to dates, anything like that, will get us there real quick. And then here's the actual sex trafficking law. So typically, people that understand human trafficking in Colorado, across the country, know that the definition involves force, fraud, or coercion, right? I'm sure you're all, if sometime this morning, have heard those sort of words. Force, fraud, or coercion. Colorado defines that a little differently. And we'll get to what coercion here means in a second. But it's a person who knowingly, and then when I train patrol officers or other people in the police department, I say a long list of verbs that basically mean some sort of involvement. Selling, recruiting, harboring, transporting. An easier one for us to prove sometimes is the transporting. If we can do surveillance and see that someone drove someone from their hotel over to the location of the date. Or arranging, if they're helping to set that up. Or and then anyone else for the purpose of coercing that person to engage in commercial sex. And so it's the coercion that's usually the difficult part to prove on the sex trafficking, on the labor trafficking, as opposed to that pimping. It's also a Class 3 felony. And this is very useful for us in prosecution. So a juvenile, someone that's doing all this same stuff with a juvenile, is a Class 2 felony. That's like a second-degree murder level. It's like the second highest level of charge. So it's a really strong law. And additionally, it's without coercion, right? Following the federal definitions of anyone that's under the age of 18 engaged in commercial sex, that person is automatically a victim. The person is automatically committing child sex trafficking. That's buying them. So we don't have to prove coercion. So reread this, taking out that word, coercion. A person who knowingly transports a juvenile for the purpose of commercial sex. Some 24-year-old that goes, yeah, I had a friend. I knew she's a sex worker. I was taking her to such and such hotel. I thought she was 19. Nah, she's 17. Age isn't a defense. That person is aiding. That person is transporting a juvenile for the purpose of commercial sex without any coercion. It could be friends. And we've made arrests on that before. And then labor trafficking. You'll see, again, also you have to know that that's what you're doing. You have to have a bunch of different verbs that basically mean you're assisting the situation or facilitating it in some way. Another person for the purpose of coercing that person to perform labor. And so it really all hinges on coercion, right? When I tell patrol officers, I'm like, hey, you got recruited to come to the CSPD for the purpose of performing labor, right? We all that work a job at some point were recruited. Maybe someone transported us to our job. Certainly there was some monetary enticement to come work. All of this says someone wants you to come work for them. It all hinges on that coercion definition right there. And it's a Class 3 felony. A couple pieces, just because people sometimes wonder like how law enforcement views victims with sex trafficking. So first of all, under law, a person that is prostituted can't be charged with prostitution if it's a result of being a victim of human trafficking. It's written such that it's an affirmative defense, meaning they could still be arrested, but then their defense attorney could raise like, hey, they're actually a victim of human trafficking at the time. Obviously, we're not going to go to that level if we can see the indicators that they're a human trafficking victim on the front end. Like, it, not only legally, but like morally and even practically, it just doesn't work to be like, hey, you're a victim, but I'm also going to charge you and then expect you to still try and cooperate with the case to charge your trafficker, right? I mean, no. If you're a HT victim, we're calling out the advocates, we're going through the case that way. I can tell you though, like sometimes on the front end, it's difficult to know whether the person is independent or whether the person is being trafficked. And that's why, like sex buying, like there is no way for a buyer to tell at all, whether looking at photos or trying to guess by ad script or looking at like, well, did someone else drop them off or no, they drove themselves or the prices that they command. I've heard all sorts of excuses from sex buyers as to how they tried to screen whether that person that they were paying to have commercial sex with was independent or not, because they want to try and justify that this was like between two consenting adults. And the truth is there's no way for that person to know for sure whether that buyer, whether that worker is really independent or being trafficked. So this is a new law that came on the books actually in 2019. I didn't find out about it until maybe late 2020, early 2021. But it's in support of labor trafficking, because that labor trafficking coercion piece can be difficult to prove sometimes. So it basically criminalizes. It used to be a civil labor situation before if your boss was intentionally not paying you. And now it makes it a crime, and it follows the theft statute severity. So it has to be more than $2,000 for it to be a felony, and that starts at F6 and moves its way up. So if there's illegal deductions going on, this can be difficult to prove though, right? It would be a lot easier to prove, like in my job, if my company was, or the city was intentionally withholding my money, because there's written contracts that say how much I get paid per hour. There are timesheets that say when I checked in and when I checked out and how much I should be getting paid. And then when we talk to someone and they go, oh geez, I work a lot. Well, how much is a lot? I have a hard time keeping track of it. And I'm not blaming the victim at all. Like, it's understandable that they have a hard time keeping track of that, right? And then we delve into it and it's like, well, maybe we work 9 or 10-hour days, but sometimes 12 or 14-hour days, and we're trying to do the calculation to average that out over the week. And then at a bare minimum, they have to be getting minimum wage, right? And then going, well, so from there, how much are you getting paid or not? And then it comes, I don't know, it can be difficult to prove. We had one that we were looking at just 4 or 5 months ago at charging this one. The case was still open when I left the unit and got promoted a couple months ago, but I don't think we were able to reach that, in part because the victim stopped cooperating with us. And then just to talk illicit massage business, I'm sure most people here are aware that the city just passed an ordinance back in late spring, particular to Colorado Springs on illicit massage business. Well, really the ordinance is about requiring licensing for legitimate massage business, so that way we can more easily enforce illicit massage business. So our legal options prior to this city ordinance were either to target the sex work, and traditionally, right, that would be like some sort of undercover sting and a raid on the place and then charging the workers with prostitution. Not terribly effective. Takes about 25 staffing hours, meaning it takes about a team of 5 people about 4 or 5 hours to plan it, execute it, do up all the reports. Even if we arrest the manager for pimping, And my team had a couple successes with that over the past 2 years on some businesses. To include back in the spring, we successfully, with the DA's office, prosecuted one of the owners for pimping. It doesn't force the business itself to close. In that case, the business closed because we talked to the landlord and said, hey, we're arresting your tenant for pimping people. And he goes, oh, I want nothing to do with that. And he closed the business. We can go through and charge people for basically offering massage without being a masseuse, without being a registered masseuse for the state. Again, you're kind of going after the workers, and it's not going to change really anything about the business. There's a public nuisance, both the state level and a city level, to seize the whole property. And that's not just like that business. If that business is in a strip mall, it would seize the entire strip mall. And when we can get that proof and start talking with landlords, it can have good effect. We were running an experiment on how much time it takes to do that versus the effectiveness in 2020 into 2021, which is a little difficult with COVID. It requires us ultimately to prove 2 separate times that prostitution is going on there. Then you start the process, and then you have to give them an opportunity to clean it up. You got to come back a 3rd time and prove that prostitution is still going on there. We went to 2 landlords. One was like, oh, I did not realize that was illicit massage going on there. They will be out. And we are not, the owner actually came back and asked the landlord if someone else, a friend of theirs, could come take over the business. And the landlord said, absolutely not. I don't want that kind of thing in my strip mall. And cool, cleaned up, gone. Harmony Spa, if anyone pays attention to where spas are at and everything, Austin Bluffs and Academy, gone the summer of 2021. Another place that we hit up was Eve Spa off Carefree. All same deal, talked to the landlord. He's like, absolutely, that's going to be gone. Is there any reason I can't put another business back in there? Massage business. And I'm like, if it's a legit massage business, right, I can't say that he can't put a business of a certain type of business in his own strip mall. So kind of like a history of enforcement. Our Vice and Human Trafficking Unit started 2014. From 2014 to 2018, there was prostitution sting ops, unauthorized practice, that's the license and the masseuse stuff, landlord, business letters. We started writing business letters to owners, and then ultimately in 2019, they contacted more places. And then when I took over the unit in 2020, it's like the things that are on the laws that we've been trying aren't effective, so we're trying some different things. One was a couple felony cases, but those are huge and massive. Like to arrest someone for pimping at a massage business was probably 350 to 400 staffing hours. And when there's about 30 illicit massage businesses in the city, we just don't have, they'll open up faster than we can close them down. And then the public nuisance order process has some effect. Here's that definition of coercion. I thought this slide was earlier, sorry. But you can see, it's laid out in Colorado statute what that coercion actually is. So it could be someone that's holding on to someone's license. That's very easy to prove. It could be someone assaulting someone else. That's very easy to prove. Sometimes debt bondage can be a little harder to actually prove because it's not like they wrote that out, right? It might have been verbally told to them or something. But we've had some successes with that in various levels of coercion. And this was talking about the full felony level investigation. Yes. Any questions for me? Yes. Sure. So the question is what to look out for in juveniles, particularly in a high school setting for sex trafficking. And really I would say a lot of them, you're just looking for kids that are vulnerable in many ways. which doesn't help you if you're in a high-risk high school. Sorry. But often, like, the victims are people with either past trauma and or emotional issues, self-esteem issues, somewhere where someone can come along and easily connect with them and sell them a dream, potentially. And then you're looking at outside behavioral exchanges. So a common path to that is actually someone that starts to first do something sex/commercial sex just by phone. So a teenager that starts to talk to older men by phone that they don't know who they are, starts exchanging nudes with that, which is a crime, by the way, if they're under 18. Not that the juvenile is going to get in trouble for it. And then from there, they go, well, if I can make $20, $30 exchanging a nude with someone, but if I actually met up with someone here in town, I could make even more money for oral sex or actually sexual intercourse or whatever. That's more of like the self-running route, if you will, for sex trafficking. Like, it doesn't have to be someone coming in and coercing them, right? It could be someone who's gotten into this on their own. One of our first juvenile cases when I took over the unit early 2020 was a high schooler whose friend also in high school was like, hey, you can just put yourself on Grindr and meet up with people, agree to sex, and when you show up, say, hey, I've actually like 20, 30, $50 to have sex with someone. And they're like, oh, that's a cool way to make money. And it seemed cool for about 3 weeks. Yeah, I mean, there was no one trafficking her in the sense of like coercing her into doing it. But all those people that she was meeting with were sex buyers. And we went back and arrested a couple for patronizing a child. That would be like where I would start for your most obvious, biggest concerns. Those are the flags we're looking for high-risk victims.
In 2008, the Human Trafficking Task Force held its first symposium. It's hard to pinpoint the date to measure from, but have you seen developments in the last 15 years or so that signify progress in stopping human trafficking? And anyone, it's open to anyone.
I can start. I think we all have answers to this question. Yes, we've seen lots of progress. Since 2008, wow, we updated the human trafficking law in Colorado to be enforceable. And I mean that. Like, the first law was not enforceable. And we only had 2 arrests and prosecutions using that law. Since then, we updated the law in 2014, we've had 250-ish. I don't have an exact count, but something like that across the state, which is huge. There's been a great deal of awareness. You were all here. There are now, I think, 17 anti-trafficking partnerships around the state, some led by law enforcement, some led by community members, some led by human services folks, raising awareness and providing comprehensive services for trafficking survivors around the state. What else? I think just talking a great deal more about labor trafficking and really bringing that to the forefront has been a major shift in the last maybe 3 to 4 years. Better services for survivors of labor trafficking, et cetera, even if we still have some work to do on prosecutions, as Sergeant Vantland mentioned. I'll start there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is you see law enforcement agencies, especially the bigger agencies, either having specific units for investigating human trafficking. Denver and CSPD, I think, are the only ones that are large enough to have specific units for it. But a lot of other agencies are getting training, and instead of it just being like no one's looking for it, there's detectives now in Pueblo and a bunch of satellite agencies in Fort Collins that have been actively investigating this for not just a couple of years, but closer to 5 to 10. And that's been a big change from probably 15 years ago.
I would agree with all of those things, and that was a lot of what I was going to say. But I think also just the continued engagement in making our laws better. So I agree with Kara. We have a situation where our law is effective. Of the 2 prosecutions we had under the prior trafficking law, one of those was overturned by the Supreme Court because the law was frankly so bad, it just really was not enforceable. So the change in law, but we've continued to advance our discussion around it and doing things like our wage theft law that the lieutenant talked about. Because as it relates to labor trafficking, it's very important to think about it. But when you think about labor trafficking, a lot of times the issue is people want to work, right? They're not being forced into work. The problem is there's an expectation that at the end of the month, going to get the paycheck, right? I expect at the end of the month, Boulder County is going to pay me my salary. But that's not labor trafficking if they don't at the end of the month, because they didn't force me to work for that month. I worked under the assumption I was going to be paid. That's not force, fraud, or coercion. So having that wage theft law passed was very important in recognizing we had a gap, that there was a huge area of vulnerability, a huge area of exploitation that didn't rise to that level that we needed to address. And so I think continuing those discussions, I think we've done that over the last 15 years and specifically the last 5 to 10 years, but we need to continue that and address those gaps as we find them.
I would just like to add, yeah, there's been really dramatic improvement in awareness in community members, in law enforcement, in healthcare workers, really teachers across every sector, people becoming aware of what's happening, and that's what I would consider the victory in the last 10, 15 years. However, trafficking has increased at the same or greater rate. So do I see the battle or it lessening? No, actually, I see a pretty dramatic escalation in trafficking. I'm really grateful for the awareness, but there's significantly more work to be done.
So, and I know there's some questions in the audience. Before I go into those, and as a lead into the next question, much remains to be done to end the suffering of human trafficking. What law or policy change would you most like to see implemented? And keeping in mind, 2 of our panelists are probably in some capacity not free to speak maybe what their opinions are because they work for governmental agencies, and that's one of the challenges. But by all means, if anyone can address that.
He's not allowed. Well, okay, so I do a lot of training and education, and maybe along the lines of raising awareness. Personally, I would like to see it mandated with a fiscal note that law enforcement agents, including patrol officers and not just detectives and higher-ups, as well as healthcare providers of all kinds and child welfare folks or anyone working with systems-involved youth, are required to do at least a human trafficking 101, if not more.
Please, no, please.
I was just going to say that's awesome. I'm all with Kara.
So even though I am a government employee, luckily part of my job is legislative affairs. And so I do a lot of work at the General Assembly and work with my boss in terms of what we want to see. And this is a key focus of mine, doing human trafficking, but also doing general legislative work. One of the areas, 2 of the areas I talked about that we're working on as a council that I think are important for next year, that area of compensating survivors who are engaged in this work and working with the Human Trafficking Council. I think that's very important because we need to recognize the experts in this field and the leaders in this field and compensate them accordingly. Also, that issue of the criminal records relief that we had talked about as well in terms of vacating convictions for individuals who those convictions were based on their trafficking experience. So those are 2 areas that we're certainly working on and need to do. To Kara's point about the fiscal note, I talked about the Human Trafficking Council. Unfortunately, there's a lot of good work that I believe we have done, certainly still more work to do, but we've done a lot of that through grants and finding community partners and finding money. frankly, in my view, we shouldn't have to find money for this. If the state is saying it's important, which the state absolutely is, and the state is doing good work, but you need to put your money where your mouth is. So for example, we have a training mandate, but we're given no money to implement that training mandate. We were able to get grants to do it, but we have a sunset review of that training mandate in the next General Assembly session, which frankly I believe is a little silly because they're having us review the work that we did that they didn't provide money for. But they're saying we did a good job, so that's great. But when we're looking at that, we need to say, you're saying we did a good job, and you're saying we should do this for another 7 years, but you need to have that fiscal note associated with it. You need to support it from a fiscal standpoint, because we can do more work if we're not scraping every barrel we can find to try and find resources.
Just one final, sorry, Chris. On a federal level, one of the things that the U.S. Advisory Council has been really proactive and advocating for is something called the Earn It Act. And we've been working to get our Colorado legislators on board in supporting this at a federal level. And what it does is holds online platforms, particularly social media platforms, accountable for where they are monetizing and or profiting from commercial sexual exploitation. And so on a federal level, that's a law that I've been fighting hard for the last couple of years and is not yet made into law.
Thank you. So, as I alluded to earlier, many times our government officials can't freely speak. I don't fall into that category anymore because I'm retired. But I can tell you that speaking to the community, you get the kind of enforcement that you demand and that you want. And if you choose not to have a voice, it will continue to decline. Our exodus of police officers is felt across the country, particularly in this community. If you want human trafficking units in your police departments and investigated, particularly in our rural police departments, because human trafficking is going to go where it's not investigated. And that's a huge risk. But again, I can tell you the defund police movement has had a catastrophic effect on your safety. If you look around, crime has gone up, it is going up. If you live in a space where you recognize your crime is going up, you're feeling it. If you live in a space where you don't feel it, you have a blanket of security that most in the community do not have. And tragically, our increase in crime starts at the lowest levels of our economy. So with that, let me open up to questions from the audience. I saw a couple of hands go up. I'll come to you.
Just to follow up, Jennisue, just to follow up, Jennisue, you give Colorado a D, and I actually took a picture of that. I am a volunteer victim advocate with the Colorado Springs Police Department. I will take that back to some very hardworking people in this regard. But what state is doing a better job? What state gets a B, gets an A that we could learn from?
That is a great question. Thank you so much for that. And I do appreciate all the hard work that this community is doing, the victim advocates, the law enforcement, and concerned citizens. That grade card comes from an organization called Shared Hope International, and you can look them up online. Every year they release a report on all 50 states. And honestly, I don't know which states are doing well. I on purpose was prepared for Colorado this morning. But it does break down each of those categories. So you can go online, it's Shared Hope International, and find those report cards.
One thing I want to say, Shared Hope is a great organization, and they do give good guidance in terms of what we need to do to support victims and survivors. I will say, take that grade with a level of caution for a couple of reasons. One, there's no state in the United States that has an A or a B. There's 2 states in the country that have a C. There are about 10-ish states that have a D, like Colorado, and 35 states in the country that have an F. So it's not graded on a curve, obviously. When the only 2 states, it's Texas and Florida, have a C, which frankly surprises me a little bit, to be honest. They are the only 2 states with a C, and then around 10 that have a D, and then about 35 or so that have an F. So that's one, and that's certainly fine because they have certain things that they want to see as an organization, a lot of which are important. The other reason I say there's a little caution that I have in terms of the Shared Hope report card, not as an organization, I'm in no way disparaging them because they are doing great work in the country and internationally. Their report card, because they're a national organization and don't necessarily have boots on the ground in Colorado, there's areas that I look at, because we always talk about it as a Human Trafficking Council when the grades come out. And we used to have an F, and then we moved up to a D a couple of years ago. But we look through what are some of the things that they say. And the problem is not necessarily understanding Colorado law. So for example, we get docked on our grades because there's a ton of things, but one good example is it says that Colorado state law does not mandate training for human services workers around human trafficking. Well, it is not mandated in the Colorado revised statutes, which is what they were looking at, but it is mandated in the Colorado regulations, which is where all of the mandates for Department of Human Services exist and where they look for all of their guidance, because Colorado revised statute doesn't provide the real details of what human services workers need to do. That's in the Colorado regulations. And so there's a number of areas in the Shared Hope recommendations where they say we should do this, and frankly, I would argue that we are, but it's just a different way in which we do it, or it's not in our state statutes and it's in our regulations or just in our practices. So those are some of the things to think about. In no way does that mean I believe we are at an A or that we're doing everything we can. There's always room to do better. There's areas that we've identified that we want to do better. But I also, when I gave my presentation and was saying that I think we are one of the leading states in the country, you may say, well, Christian, you're crazy because we have a D. That's why I wanted to give some of that background around the Shared Hope, because I do stand by the fact we need to do more, we can do more. But with that in mind, when we look at the 50 states in the union, frankly, Colorado's really at the lead of some of our anti-trafficking efforts.
Hello? Okay, I'll just add one thing. Thank you for clarifying all of that, because that's what I was going to follow up with as well. Yeah, just take all of it with a grain of salt, because it's relative to what Shared Hope wants certain laws to be passed. And I think a lot of states would argue what Christian just argued. I think Colorado's actually doing a pretty decent job from a legislative perspective, agreeing that we still have a lot of work to do. But I was going to say that there are several states that are doing really cool stuff in courts, like innovative trauma courts. Places like Ohio, New York, Florida, and Texas actually have some really interesting trauma courts. So I encourage you to look at that. The Center for Court Innovation has a great deal of information on that, including our Rest Court here in Denver, where we have a trauma court for child survivors of sex and labor trafficking. So there's really cool stuff happening there, and Ohio generally has some really good laws, so that's one state to look to, aside from the obvious Florida, Texas, New York, and California, which always seems to have those laws ahead of the game.
All right, next.
Thank you. Following up on the teacher who wanted to talk about signs in high school, along with Jennisue, you talking about legislation regarding online, can you, all of you, elaborate more on what does take place online in terms of, grooming, coercing through gaming, through any other, I think I'd like to know more about it, and I think it is an area that parents, teachers, and anybody that is around middle school, high school in particular, need to know more about.
Sure, it's hard to put numbers to, but if you have teenagers in your house, you know that even if you restrict access to their phone and everything else of the sort, that's just where their social life largely is at these days in our society. So that's how people typically get a hold of other people. In that situation that I talked to when the teacher asked the question earlier, all that was done online. And some of that was maybe self-facilitated, but sometimes too we see people reaching out, making initial contact, that selection, that grooming through social media. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm aware of like Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. Those are just like the mainstream ones. Then there's all sorts of like specialized, every gaming community, every whatever else there is on there too. So that is probably the recent past and continued future of where that's going to be for grooming.
Yeah, I think we can all speak to this. All of that, what he just said, and yeah, and you can go online and look for like a list of like apps parents should be aware of or something. You can kind of Google around and find lots of lists. They're constantly changing. Look for a kid with many social media handles. Look for changes in behavior that maybe are due to trauma, so missing a lot of school and maybe sleeping a lot in school because they're so tired because they're working at night. Those kinds of situations, I think, there's just so much to talk about. I'm trying to figure out what. We see sextortion, which I haven't heard mentioned too much yet, where, someone meets someone online, they take it offline, right? They exchange phone numbers, now they're texting. Someone sends nudes, they're convinced to send nudes, they think it's someone their own age, and the person turns out to not be their age, and then they've concocted some kind of, what's the word, like a whole board full of all these pictures, and they say, now I've got all these pictures of you, now I need you to send me a video of you doing something sexual. And if they don't, I'm going to take this board of pictures that I have of you, and I'm going to send it to your mom, and I'm going to send it to your priest, and I'm going to send it to your school, and I'm going to put it on Pornhub, and I'm going to tell everybody. And so they send the video, and then all of this isn't necessarily trafficking yet. It's lots of other laws broken, but not necessarily trafficking. And then they take that video and they start selling it or something, right? So someone could be being trafficked out of their own bedroom with their parents downstairs. So trust but verify your kids' social media.
Yeah, that is a great way to summarize. So much of what's happening online is kids are meeting perpetrators. FBI right now estimates at least 500,000 perpetrators are online every day. They are reaching kids through messaging in their games. They're not supposed to be able to. A lot of them are supposed to be private, but social media, gaming, they start building a relationship. The 12-year-old kid thinks they're playing with another 12-year-old kid. And the conversation gets progressively more sexualized to the point that the child starts self-generating child sex abuse material on the request of this perpetrator, who they think is another 12-year-old, and it spirals from there. So it is super, super common. I don't have the stats in front of me, but it is escalating dramatically. One thing that parents can do is have really great open conversations with your kids. There's another thing called the Bark app. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It is not invading the kids' privacy per se. You're not seeing all of their messages, but you with your child set alerts for certain things: bullying, self-harm, eating disorders, sexual content, nudity. And if those things happen within your kid's phone, within their online world, you as a parent get a notification so that you can have a conversation with your kid, make sure that they're not being exploited, being abused. Cyberbullying is an online, a reason for youth suicide. And so a Bark app would be one proactive way.
Advertisements. And it's that direct sort of recruitment side for the victims, but also sort of the direct solicitation side, the direct offering side that is more one-on-one. So it's happening in gaming apps, social media, a lot in the dating apps, or, sort of the meetup quick sex type of apps, which become a lot harder from a law enforcement standpoint for us to be able to address and do sting operations because it does require that peer-to-peer connection.
I'll just add that, I think it starts. Advocate for training for your kids in school. Yeah, I mean, we provide it, but other organizations do as well. I'm really not trying to, ours is free, so is others. It's all free. It's the reason that it's not in schools is because schools are scared to bring it in. And some parents are opposed to bringing it in because they think their kids are too young to talk about it. And I'm not judging anyone who feels that way. I mean, if you feel that way, that's fine. But your kids aren't going to hear about this until it's too late if we don't talk about it. We've just got to get the information out there. So I Empathize has a great program in schools. There's a number of others. I really like that. Bark. Thorn is another place where people can report. You can go to NCMEC. There's online stuff on NCMEC where you can report situations. So just kind of, like I said, Google around and find some of that stuff, but get your kids trained too. These conversations, they look a little bit different with youth than they do with, with adults in the room, so it's not quite as scary, maybe as my presentation this morning, but it's really important just to plant those seeds.
So also as a father of teenagers, I can say that, first off, and I didn't hear it mentioned, I hope I'm backed up by this by our legal counsel, a child under 18, which is a child, does not have privacy rights in your home. That includes written material, digital material, cell phones. Kind of with that is the dynamic that goes, if you're going to begin to dive into these social media platforms and all of the things your kids use, you're going to inherit a part-time job to try to learn all that stuff. And they're going to know it better than you are. They're also going to know how to hide it better than you are. And Snapchat will become your bane. I've experienced this personally. The other thing I would advocate for is minimal, if at any, private internet, cell phone access, late night hours, anything like that, where that's where those things take place. I also experienced the dynamic of just saying, well, I'm just going to take your cell phone. Well, guess what? That's their social world. So there's an entire world that exists, and if you take that from them, it's a balance, it's a judgment call, but keep in mind, you're going to take their social group from them. That can have also compounding effects. Anyway, sorry, my little speech there. Anyway, other questions? Good, yeah.
I live up the road in Castle Rock, and a couple of years ago, I attended the beginning of a couple of training sessions at churches. This was an effort to reach out to the faith-based community. And the group training orientation was consisted of a nonprofit entity up north of Denver, the Denver area FBI task force in my county, Tony Spurlock, the former Douglas County Sheriff. Chris, when I looked at one of your charts, a very complicated chart, I think I saw a child exploitation FBI human trafficking task force. The question arose, is there, and I don't know what the official designation was of the FBI representatives that trained us, but is there an adult task force, and are there more than one or two in the state? Is there down in Colorado Springs an FBI task force or a branch off?
Great question. So there's work being done. It's not the same as the one as I understand it, but I defer to the lieutenant specifically in terms of Colorado Springs. But the FBI one, frankly, that has been an issue historically. And I talked about how, we were doing some really strong efforts in terms of child sexual trafficking. And that was through some of the partnerships with our federal partners, with HSI, with FBI. It used to be called the Innocence Lost Task Force. It then moved to the Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force. But there is not one on the federal side as it relates to adult trafficking, whether that be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. That is something that is being done state by state. We're working on that in Colorado, but we have a long ways to go. It's frankly harder to identify in some ways. We've done some things to try and identify our child sex trafficking victims. I talked about, for example, the screening device that the Department of Human Services uses. I think that's a great screening device, and it's screening a lot of kids that are going through human services, that are going through the juvenile justice process. There's not the same mechanism for adults. And frankly, adults don't necessarily have the same communication with folks. There's not necessarily folks looking for some of this, which is why the awareness, these conversations, the public awareness flyers, that sort of stuff, becomes important for people to do that. But to your point about enforcement or investigations, on the adult side, there are not those statewide task forces that are doing it. There's some of the local jurisdictions, some of the metro task forces, whether that be the Metro Vice Task Force that was talked about down here or up in the Denver metro area.
Yeah, and I would just second that to say Denver has the task force between Denver PD, some other agencies, the FBI for children. Denver PD also has a separate adult human trafficking unit within Denver, and I'm sure they're a resource to other agencies around there. Down here we have a human trafficking unit, the Vice unit. 98+% of what they do is looking for the human trafficking in those felony cases. We're not in an official task force either with Homeland Security or FBI. Those offices here are understandably smaller than they are up at Denver, those federal partners, but we do work with them case by case as needed because they can help us. Very often we're like, hey, something started here, but by the time we learned about it, those people moved on to another state. And if I just call the local agency in another state, by the time they get that information, those people might have moved on somewhere else. So passing that kind of case to a federal partner to work at the national level can be easier.
I'll also tell you that the Colorado State Patrol has a human trafficking and smuggling interdiction unit. CSI has a human trafficking unit. It's only 3 people, which is Colorado CBI. Sorry, Colorado Bureau of Investigation. My bad. And the FBI agents who are stationed like in this region is huge. Actually, it includes like Pueblo and it's like half of Colorado, but there are a couple of FBI officers that are committed to this jurisdiction. And when we get calls to the human trafficking hotline, we're reaching out to the folks that are in whatever jurisdiction the call comes from. So if there's a call that comes for Colorado Springs, we're going to hand it over to folks like Lieutenant here, but also the FBI contacts in the region. So like everyone who has jurisdiction on the call gets a notification.
More questions? Yep. Let me come to this side of the room here.
What kind of resources are being provided to people who are being pulled out of like the labor trafficking situations?
Very few people are being pulled out, maybe none. So they're just leaving. They're looking for help. So just to clarify that, right? I've never heard of a labor trafficking raid ever. So I don't know if anyone else ever has, but yeah. So there are resources, however. So I mean, I could go on and on. There's probably 100 resources that are out there for immigrant survivors of labor trafficking. So things like Colorado Legal Services, which offers civil legal services, they're huge. They get federal funding to provide those services for free. Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network also provides that kind of support. However, they just work with people who already are in deportation proceedings, and the Aurora Detention Center or the Child Detention Center for immigrants that's not in Aurora. It's somewhere north of Denver, one of the suburbs. And then, there's just dozens of others. Servicios de la Raza, Mi Casa, Focus Points. There's just so many organizations out there that offer case management, culturally appropriate resources, seeking housing, seeking mental health resources. I mean, they do exist. I think that just to put a point on that, though those resources do exist, so few people know about them or feel empowered to ask for them. And because they're not being pulled out, so to speak, right, so many people aren't accessing them. So they exist, and we can make referrals to them, but I think we're still lacking generally.
I think your point brings up an important one, and I'll circle back to our first question, which is, what have we done well over the last 15 years? And I think the availability of those services, although there can always be more, is great, because if I was dealing with a trafficking situation, say 7 years ago, when I first started doing this work, more than half of those services didn't exist back then. And so the struggle that we realized is, we would go in, have a situation and say, hey, you're no longer with your trafficker. We're prosecuting that person. Like, this is great. You're a survivor. You're no longer, being victimized. And they're like, great. I now don't have a place to live. I don't have a job. I don't have an education. I have 5 different criminal charges against me. I got to get a divorce from this guy. And all you're saying is you're going to go prosecute the guy. That doesn't help me in any way. And so that was something that early on in our anti-trafficking world, we realized we're not doing the community, and particularly survivors, any kind of justice if we just say we're coming in as law enforcement and prosecutors and grabbing the guy and throwing him in jail and prosecuting it. That is not the work of a human trafficking prosecutor or a human trafficking detective anymore. It's a much more holistic approach, but only because of the partnerships with a lot of these resources that have developed over the last 15 years.
So real quick question also I wanted to address, and this is more to Lieutenant Van Land. Now that patronizing a prostitute and solicitation of a prostitute is a petty offense, are there being arrests in this area, or police actively investigating those?
I would say that even before I took over the unit in 2020, but at the start of 2020 when I took over the unit, it was me and 3 detectives. And that third one came along in 2018. In theory, as soon as we get the numbers, on paper, we'll grow some more. The focus for that unit has always been on those felony level crimes, the sex trafficking, the labor trafficking, which we need to uncover more of, but we have had some cases, the pimping, the child sex trafficking cases. We don't really have the time to put in for proactively going after just prostitution. So by and large, those were not sought after, not enforced. There were times that we went out on a specific case on a particular individual where the information looked like that person was being pimped or trafficked. Turned out they were independent, but those are pretty rare in those sort of circumstances. And so with it being a petty offense, even more so, there's certainly not a cell to higher ups to be yeah, we're going to put in a whole bunch of staffing hours to go after a bunch of petty offenses. The caveat to that, though, is, the buying, that patronizing and the soliciting, that's what fuels the trafficking. So there was discussion for a little while in the spring and the summer about us doing operations specifically just to target buyers, even though it's petty offenses. So while I don't see CSPD putting in the time to target, if you will, the sex workers on petty offense prostitution, there is some work at times to go after buyers. But even then, most of the time, we're trying to focus on buyers of children because they're felonies. So,
other questions? Yes.
We're getting a wonderful big picture of what you guys are doing, and I'd like to go back to what we as people at home or in our workplace can do every day. Okay, we've done the red flags, but Jennisue, you mentioned that list from the Labor Department about businesses. I'm sure we can go look up the Labor Department's website and spend a couple of hours and find it, but do you happen to know what that website is? Because that's just one simple thing of human dignity that we could all practice every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. First, there's at least 2 apps. One is the Sweat and Toil app, and you can get that from the App Store. It's on both Android and Apple. And the Sweat and Toil app, you can look up products and figure out where it's coming from, what the supply chain was, if there is forced labor or child labor common with this product. You can also see a list of items that have been banned or are restricted because they have been identified. So the Sweat and Toil app would be one place to start. The other is ILO, the International Labor Organization. ILO, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so you can look at ILO online, ILO.org, I think, is the app that I was getting my statistics from for the 177 products from 56 countries, comes from their website. But the app is easy on the go. You can be at Trader Joe's or Walmart, and you can look at a specific product and see if there is forced labor in that product. Do you have more to add to that, Kara?
Yeah, I would. Natural grocers. So Whole Foods does a great job of identifying organically grown foods, but Natural Grocers actually takes into account human rights. So, I mean, I don't work for Natural Grocers or anything. I'm just saying, like, I shop there because then I don't have to put so much effort into what I shop for, to be honest, because it's exhausting. And then, Caitlin, do you have that chocolate website? Will you look it up real quick? Chocolate Scorecard for Halloween. Check out your chocolate.
We're going to go ahead and conclude our panel, but to add on to that question, what do you do now as a community? What do you do now as an individual? Well, for starters, as you walk out the door on the right side is the Southern Colorado Human Trafficking Task Force. Their sign up. You can attend our meetings twice a month, the second Tuesday of every month. Our next meeting is going to be tentatively scheduled at Mount Carmel Veterans Center. We're in flux, establishing a new area, but become educated on it also. Also, Restore Innocence is here. They are I beg your pardon, Reclaiming Hope. I stand corrected. Reclaiming Hope is here putting together holiday bags and survivor kits that you can also contribute directly to. So no matter where you stand and whatever industry you're in, wherever you live, recognize that this is a prolific and pernicious problem that is not going away anytime soon. But your involvement, both your advocacy with our government officials, and I say to anybody that feels motivated enough to put a sign up and go stand in a demonstration somewhere, your time is much more beneficial if you show up at a council meeting, city, county, state level, be an advocate to your direct elected officials, advocate for those resources. So with that, I'm going to thank all of our panel. We greatly appreciate the time that you spent here, and even as people who have been in this issue for as many years as some of us have, we learn new things in each one of these things. So I invite you all and implore you all to be involved in your community, be involved in the people around you, their lives, relationships, and when you find something like this, please refer it to higher levels, to whatever you can do. Thank you very much. I know some of our presenters will be around, and I really appreciate the time and energy you guys took to be here. Thank you very much.